The rain was ice cold against my face as I stood on the sidewalk watching my clothes soak into muddy puddles. Behind me, the door of my childhood home slammed shut, locked. Forever. Just 30 minutes earlier, I'd walked through that door after losing my job sabotaged by a jealous colleague. I expected comfort. Maybe a hug. Instead, my father looked at me with pure disgust and said the words that would echo in my mind forever. "You're every mistake this family ever made." My mother didn't even let me explain. She grabbed my belongings and hurled them into the street like I was trash. "You don't belong here," she hissed. "We're done cleaning up after you." My sister. She recorded the whole thing on her phone laughing before demanding I keep paying her car loan. "You're the one who offered," she sneered. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I owned a company worth millions. That the beachfront property they once mocked as my pathetic fantasy was sitting in my name fully paid. That the modest apartment I lived in was a choice, not a limitation. But I said nothing. I just picked up my soaked clothes and walked away. Because 20 years ago, a man I thought was a stranger saved me from this same family. He taught me everything. He left me everything. And buried in his final letters was a truth so devastating it would destroy the people who destroyed me. This is the story of how the daughter they threw away became the woman who owned their fate, and trust me, by the end, you'll understand why they should have treated me better when they had the chance. My name is Kimberly Brooks. I'm 38 years old, and until this morning, I was a senior logistics coordinator at a mid-sized distribution company. I've spent the last 15 years building a career brick by brick, climbing from warehouse assistant to management through nothing but hard work and determination. But today, all of that came crashing down because of office politics and a colleague who saw me as competition rather than a teammate. The drive home felt endless. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, and I kept replaying the moment my supervisor called me into his office. "We're letting you go effective immediately," he'd said, as if those words were just another line item on his daily task list. The accusations against me were lies carefully constructed by someone who knew exactly how to make me look incompetent. But in that moment, none of that mattered. I was out. Jobless. And the first thought that entered my mind wasn't about my career or my finances. It was simpler and more desperate than that. I need to go home. I need my family. How pathetic that thought would prove to be. The house looked exactly as it always did when I pulled into the driveway. A neat, modest suburban home with trimmed hedges and a mailbox my father repainted every spring. I'd walked through that front door thousands of times over 38 years, each time carrying the same foolish hope that maybe this would be the time they'd actually see me as something other than a burden. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit by the familiar scene of casual indifference. My father sat in his worn leather recliner, eyes fixed on the television. My mother stood near the kitchen phone pressed to her ear, gossiping with someone. My younger sister Ashley sprawled across the couch taking yet another selfie. Not one of them looked up when I entered. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice smaller than I'd intended. "Something happened at work today." My father's head turned toward me with immediate suspicion. "What did you do this time, Kimberly? Not what happened, or are you okay? Just that automatic assumption that whatever went wrong must have been my fault." "I didn't do anything wrong," I started, but my mother cut me off. "Oh Lord, not another work drama," she said, barely lowering her phone. "Linda, hold on, my daughter's having some kind of crisis again." She said crisis with audible quotation marks. "Kimberly, we have real problems right now. The mortgage is late, your father's car needed $800 in repairs, and your sister needs help with expenses. We don't have time for whatever workplace conflict you've gotten yourself into." "I was fired," I said. "I got terminated this morning." The silence that followed was heavy and accusatory. My father rose slowly from his recliner, his face transforming from annoyed to disgusted. "Fired." He said it like a curse word. "Do you have any idea how this reflects on this family I have to show my face in this community? I have colleagues and friends and a reputation. And you just can't help yourself, can you? You're every mistake this family ever made wrapped up in one person." Those words hit me like physical blows. Every mistake this family ever made. I'd heard variations of this my entire life, but never stated quite so plainly. My mother set down her phone and crossed her arms. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Do you remember when you insisted on going to that state school instead of the community college we could actually afford? We told you it was a waste, and look where it got you, a mediocre job you couldn't even keep. You're 38 years old with no husband, no prospects, and apparently no ability to hold down steady employment. What exactly have you accomplished, Kimberly? Wrong college, wrong career, wrong life choices, no marriage, no success worth mentioning." Each word was a familiar wound reopened, and I realized this wasn't shock speaking. This was what they'd always believed about me. "And now what?" Ashley chimed in, not bothering to look up from her phone. "You're going to mooch off Mom and Dad because I need you to keep paying my car loan, Kimberly. You're the one who offered to help me get that car. You can't just back out now." Something inside me cracked. I'd been paying Ashley's car loan for 2 years, helping with my parents' bills whenever they called with emergencies. I'd been the dutiful daughter trying to earn their approval, their love, their basic recognition that I mattered. And in return, I got this. My father moved toward the stairs. "You're not staying here, Kimberly. I want you out. Tonight." "What?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "You heard me. We're done enabling your incompetence. You're a grown woman who can't manage her life. That's not our problem anymore. Get your things and get out. Figure out your life somewhere else." I watched numb as my mother marched upstairs. I heard drawers opening, hangers scraping. Then she appeared at the top of the stairs with armfuls of my clothes and without ceremony opened the front door and threw them onto the front lawn. It had started to rain. Of course it had. "Mom, what are you doing?" "What I should have done years ago," she said, making another trip. Shoes, books, old photo albums, all of it went onto the wet grass. "You don't belong here, Kimberly. You never did. You were always different, always difficult. We've sacrificed enough for you. We're done." Ashley had her phone up now, recording the whole scene, smiling like this was entertainment. Through the window I could see neighbors watching from behind curtains. My father appeared beside my mother. "Out, Kimberly. Now. Don't come back expecting us to clean up your messes." I walked out into the rain. The cold water hit my face and mixed with tears I didn't remember starting to cry. I bent down and began gathering my soaked belongings from the lawn, my clothes heavy with rainwater, my photo albums already warping. My hands moved automatically while my mind struggled to process what had just happened. 38 years of trying to be good enough, of hoping that eventually they'd look at me with something other than disappointment. 38 years of being the family scapegoat. And it had all led to this moment standing in the rain, discarded like trash. As I loaded my soaked belongings into my car, something shifted inside me. Not broke, but shifted like tectonic plates rearranging themselves. I looked back at the house one last time at the warm light glowing from windows that would never welcome me again. But as the rain soaked through my clothes, I made a promise to myself they would never see me beg again. I sat in my car for a long time that night, engine running, heater blasting against the cold rain with nowhere to go. My phone buzzed. Ashley had posted the video of my expulsion to social media with the caption, "Family drama, am I right?" followed by a laughing emoji. 43 people had already liked it. As I stared at that glowing screen, memories I'd spent years trying to bury came flooding back with brutal clarity. This wasn't the first time I'd been erased by my family. It was just the most public. The earliest memory I have of truly understanding I was different came when I turned 8 years old. I woke up that morning excited the way children are on their birthdays, expecting cake and presents and maybe a few friends. Instead, I found my mother in the kitchen preparing elaborate cupcakes with pink frosting and edible glitter. "Are those for my party?" I asked, hopeful. She looked at me with genuine confusion. "It's Ashley's half-birthday, sweetheart. We always celebrate her half birthdays, remember? Ashley was 5. She got a full party for her actual birthday and another celebration 6 months later. My 8th birthday passed without acknowledgement. When I finally worked up courage to remind my mother 3 days later, she said, "Oh, Kimberly, you're too old to make such a fuss. Besides, we just spent money on Ashley's party." That was the first time I learned my needs were inconvenient. When I was 12, my school held a spring concert where I had a small solo in the choir. I'd practiced for weeks. The concert ended at 8 in the evening, and by 9 o'clock I was the only student left. My mother finally arrived at 9:45, annoyed. "I completely forgot you had a thing tonight," she said without apologizing. We were watching Ashley's dance recital video and lost track of time. In the car, she complained about missing her favorite television show. She never asked how the concert went. The next week, when I mentioned feeling hurt, she snapped at me. "Honestly, Kimberly, you're so dramatic. Sometimes I forget we have 2 daughters. You're so self-sufficient that you just blend into the background." I learned to blend into the background very well after that. At 15, I brought home a report card with straight A's, including advanced placement courses. I set it beside Ashley's report card showing C's and 1 D. My father picked up Ashley's. "Look at this B- in English," he exclaimed, pulling her into a hug. "That's such an improvement, sweetheart. We're so proud of you." He didn't touch my report card. When I quietly pointed out my grades, he shrugged. "Well, that's what we expect from you. Ashley actually tries hard and makes progress. You've always found school easy." My achievements didn't count because they came naturally, while Ashley's mediocrity deserved celebration because it required effort. The scapegoat role truly shaped who I became. When I was 10, Ashley knocked over my mother's expensive crystal vase while running through the house. The moment my mother heard the crash, Ashley burst into tears and pointed at me. "Kimberly made me do it. She was chasing me." It was a complete lie. I'd been in my room reading, but my mother believed Ashley without question, and I was grounded for 2 weeks while Ashley received sympathy for being traumatized. I learned that truth didn't matter as much as who cried the prettiest tears. At 14, I won an academic achievement award at our school's honors ceremony. My parents attended, which I'd foolishly interpreted as support. The moment we got to the car afterward, my mother turned to me with anger tight in her face. "Did you have to wear that dress, Kimberly? It's 2 years old and doesn't fit properly. Mrs. Henderson asked me if we were having financial troubles. You embarrassed this family tonight." I'd worn my best dress, the only nice one I owned. Ashley had gotten 3 new dresses that season. But my achievement wasn't the focus. How my appearance reflected on my mother was all that mattered. At 16, I got a part-time job at a grocery store, saving money for college applications and school supplies my parents said they couldn't afford. I was proud of my independence. 3 months in, my parents sat me down and explained that Ashley needed to attend a summer cheerleading camp costing $1,500. "You've been saving money and family helps family," my father said. It wasn't a request. They took nearly all my savings, leaving me barely enough for 1 college application. When I protested, my mother called me selfish. "Your sister has opportunities you never had. The least you can do is support her dreams." I learned that my money, my time, my effort, none of it belonged to me. It all belonged to everyone except me. But the final breaking point came when I was 17. I'd worked so hard, studying late into the night, maintaining perfect grades despite working part-time. When the acceptance letter came from the state university with a partial scholarship, I was ecstatic. I ran downstairs to share the news, believing surely this achievement would make them proud. "Mom, I got accepted, and they're giving me a scholarship that covers half the tuition." She turned from the stove slowly, and the expression on her face wasn't pride. It was cold calculation. "How much is the other half?" I told her, explaining that with my job and maybe a small student loan I could manage it. Her face darkened. "Absolutely not. We need you here, Kimberly. Your father's hours have been cut, and we need someone contributing to this household. You're going to work full-time and help with family expenses. Your sister still has 3 years of high school left, and she'll need support for her activities." "But Mom, this is my chance to..." The slap came so fast I didn't see it coming. My cheek burned and tears sprang to my eyes from shock more than pain. "You selfish girl," she hissed. "How dare you think about abandoning your family when we need you most? You'll turn down that scholarship, get a full-time job, and contribute like an adult. This family sacrificed for you for 17 years. Now it's your turn to sacrifice." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my acceptance letter on my nightstand. I could hear my parents downstairs discussing Ashley's upcoming birthday party, debating between a DJ or a live band. They were planning to spend more on one party than my entire year of college would have cost them. At 2 a.m, I made my decision. I packed one bag with clothes, my important documents, the little money I'd managed to hide, and the acceptance letter. I opened my bedroom window, climbed down the trellis that had always been my secret escape route, and walked away from the only home I'd ever known. I spent that first night at a youth shelter downtown, lying on a thin mattress in a room with 5 other girls, wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. I had no money, no plan, and no family who would care enough to even look for me. I was completely, terrifyingly alone. At rock bottom, cold and scared in a shelter bed, I had no idea that the man who would change everything was watching me from across the room. The shelter smelled like institutional soap and desperation. I'd been there for 3 days, spending my time in the common area, avoiding conversation with the other residents, and reading a worn copy of The Basics of Small Business Management I'd found in the donation bin. It was survival instinct, really. If I kept my mind occupied with words and concepts and possibilities, I didn't have to think about the fact that I was 17, homeless, and completely alone in the world. No one from my family had called. No one had come looking for me. I'd simply vanished from their lives, and they hadn't even noticed I was gone. On the 4th morning, a man I'd seen volunteering at the shelter sat down across from me at one of the worn cafeteria tables. He was maybe in his early 50s, with gray threading through his dark hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of time spent outdoors and hardships endured. He set down 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across the table to me. "You've been reading that same book for 3 days," he said, his voice calm and without judgment. "Most people here watch television or sleep. What makes you different?" I looked up, immediately defensive. I'd learned not to trust kindness, especially from strangers. "I'm not different, I just prefer reading." "That's a business management textbook," he continued, unbothered by my cold tone. "Not exactly light entertainment. You planning to start a company?" Something about his directness disarmed me. "I'm planning to never need anyone's permission to exist." I said the words coming out more honestly than I'd intended. "I'm planning to build something that's mine, that no one can take away, that doesn't depend on anyone else deciding I'm worth keeping around." He smiled then, and it was the first smile I'd received in weeks that felt genuine. "Henry Sawyer," he said, extending his hand. "And that's the best answer I've heard in a long time. Most people your age are planning their weekends, not their independence." We talked for over an hour that morning. Henry told me he was a veteran who'd served 2 tours before coming home and building a small property management business. He owned a handful of rental properties and managed several more for other owners. It wasn't glamorous work, he explained, but it was steady and honest, and it had given him a comfortable life. When he asked about my situation, I gave him the abbreviated version, leaving out the emotional details, but covering the facts. Left home at 17. No support system. Determined to make it on my own. "I need someone to help with property maintenance and tenant coordination," he said as our conversation wound down. "Light repairs, collecting rent, handling complaints. It's not easy work, but it pays fair, and I'll teach you everything you need to know. You'd start next week if you're interested." I stared at him, waiting for the catch. There was always a catch. "Why would you offer that to someone you just met?" "Because I see something in you that most people miss when they look at kids in shelters," Henry said simply. "I see someone who's already decided to survive, who's reading business textbooks instead of giving up. That's rare. That's valuable. And honestly, I need the help." I took the job. What choice did I have? But I remained guarded those first few months, waiting for Henry to reveal his true intentions, to demand something inappropriate, to turn out like every other adult in my life who'd disappointed me. It never happened. Henry was simply who he appeared to be, a decent man offering a fair opportunity. Over the following years, Henry became the teacher I'd never had. He taught me how to read financial statements, how to negotiate with contractors, how to assess property value and identify good investments. He paid for my community college courses in business and accounting, explaining that education was an investment, not an expense. He introduced me to his network of small business owners, real estate investors, and local entrepreneurs, always presenting me as his associate rather than his employee, giving me credibility I hadn't earned yet but would grow into. But more than the practical skills, Henry taught me something I'd never learned at home. "Money is just a tool, Kimberly," he'd say during our weekly business review meetings. "It's important, yes, but it's not the foundation. Self-respect is the real currency. The ability to look yourself in the mirror and know you acted with integrity, that you treated people fairly, that you built something honest that's worth more than any bank balance." He never asked me to be grateful. Never reminded me of what he'd done for me. Never made me feel like I owed him anything beyond fair work for fair pay. His regard for me was patient and unconditional, and it slowly, carefully healed wounds I didn't even realize I still carried. When I turned 25, Henry invited me to dinner at his modest home. Over coffee after the meal, he said something that changed everything. "I need to tell you something I should have told you years ago." He began, his expression serious. "I knew your father, your real father. We served together in the military. He was a good man, Kimberly. One of the best I ever knew. He died in service when you were very young." I felt the world tilt slightly. "You knew him?" "I did. And before he deployed on what turned out to be his final mission, he asked me for a promise. He said if anything happened to him, I should watch out for his family. I took that promise seriously." Henry's eyes held mine. "I've been watching from a distance for years, Kimberly. I saw how the Brooks family treated you. I saw you being erased, blamed, used. When you walked into that shelter at 17, I knew it was finally time to keep my promise properly." Tears streamed down my face as understanding crashed over me. This wasn't random kindness. This was loyalty to a fallen friend. This was a promise kept across years and circumstances. Henry had been protecting me, guiding me, preparing me for a life my real father would have wanted for me. "You're not alone," Henry said gently. "You never were. You just didn't know it yet." For the first time since I could remember, I felt like I belonged somewhere, like I mattered to someone, like I had family, real family, chosen family, the kind that shows up and stays and keeps promises made to the dead. But there was one secret Henry still kept locked away, a truth that would change everything I thought I knew about herself. Henry died on a Tuesday morning in spring, 5 years after that conversation about my real father. He was 66 years old, and the heart attack was sudden, massive, and mercifully quick, according to the paramedics. I got the call from the hospital while I was reviewing tenant applications at the small office we shared, and the world simply stopped making sense. Henry had been the one constant in my life for 13 years, the only person who'd ever looked at me and seen value instead of burden. The only real father I'd ever known. And now he was gone. The funeral was small but meaningful, attended by the business owners Henry had mentored, the veterans he'd served with, and the handful of people whose lives he'd quietly changed without ever seeking recognition. I stood at the front of the chapel and delivered a eulogy about the man who'd taught me that family wasn't about blood or obligation, but about choice and consistency. My voice broke only once when I said, "Henry saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. He believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, and he loved me when I didn't think I was worth loving." A week after the funeral, Henry's attorney called me into his office for the reading of the will. I sat in the leather chair across from his massive desk, expecting perhaps a small inheritance, maybe enough for a down payment on my own place, or to expand the business I'd been building alongside Henry. What I wasn't expecting was for the attorney to slide a folder across the desk containing property deeds, bank statements, investment accounts, and a locked metal box with my name engraved on a small brass plate. Mr. Sawyer was very specific about his wishes. The attorney said, his expression kind but professional. He's left you everything, Miss Brooks. The rental properties, his personal residence, his savings and investment accounts, and several documents he wanted you to have. He tapped the locked box. This is marked with instructions that you're to open it only when they come back. He didn't elaborate on who they referred to, but he was quite adamant about the timing. I stared at the papers in front of me, unable to process what I was seeing. The beachfront property alone was worth more than I'd earn in a decade. The savings account held over $200,000. The investment portfolio was carefully diversified, showing years of strategic planning and patient wealth building. Henry had given me not just assets, but a foundation to build an entire future on. He'd been planning this for years, the attorney continued. He updated his will annually, always with meticulous notes about how these assets should be used. He left you very specific instructions. He pulled out another folder, this one filled with Henry's handwriting. He wanted you to have the tools to build something significant, something that would give you security and power. His words, not mine. The beachfront property became my focus. Henry's notes were detailed and strategic. Location is everything. This area is being rezoned for mixed commercial and residential development. Don't sell. Develop. Rent. Build equity. This is your foundation, Kimberly. Treat it like the precious gift it is. The property sat on a prime piece of coastal land in an area that was transitioning from sleepy beach town to upscale destination. Property values were climbing and developers were circling like sharks. Using Henry's savings as seed capital and following the business model he'd taught me, I threw myself into building something substantial. I started with property management, taking on clients who owned rental units in the area. Then I moved into small-scale development, renovating distressed properties, and either selling them at profit or keeping them as rentals. I worked 80-hour weeks applying every lesson Henry had taught me about negotiation, financial management, and identifying opportunities others missed. I formed LLCs to keep my personal name off public records, operating through corporate structures that provided both legal protection and privacy. Within 3 years, I'd turned Henry's nest egg into a thriving operation worth several $1 million. I lived modestly, reinvesting profits rather than indulging in luxury. Henry's voice echoed in my head constantly. Real power doesn't announce itself. The people who need everyone to know they're successful are usually the most insecure. Build something real, something solid, and let the work speak for itself. One evening, while organizing Henry's personal papers from his home office, I found a folder marked Brooks Family Military Benefits Investigation. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were newspaper clippings about my biological father's death in military service, official documents from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and Henry's handwritten notes spanning several years. What I read made my blood run cold. My real father had died when I was 3 years old, killed in action during a deployment. As his surviving child, I should have been the primary beneficiary of dependency and indemnity compensation, a monthly stipend meant to support military children who'd lost a parent in service. There were also educational benefits, survivor health care, and a substantial life insurance payout. Henry's investigation showed that the Brooks family had filed paperwork claiming they were providing care for me as dependent guardians, and they'd collected every penny of those benefits for years. But the paperwork was fraudulent. The Brooks family had falsified documents claiming financial hardship and sole responsibility for my care, when in reality they'd spent the money on themselves while treating me like an unwanted burden. There were photocopied checks made out to Mr. Brooks' bank statements showing deposits that coincided with benefit payment dates, and Henry's notes documenting exactly how much money had been paid out over the years. Tens of thousands of dollars meant for my education, my health care, my basic support, all of it stolen while they made me feel like I should be grateful they let me exist in their home. Henry had been quietly investigating this for years, gathering evidence but never telling me. In his notes, he'd written, "She's been through enough. She doesn't need to know how deeply they betrayed her until she's strong enough to handle the truth without it destroying her. When the time is right, she'll have the tools to fight back if she chooses." The realization hit me like a physical blow. My suffering at the hands of the Brooks family wasn't just emotional neglect or favoritism. It was systematic theft. They'd taken money meant to care for me and used it to pamper Ashley while making me pay for my own school supplies. They'd cashed checks in my dead father's name while telling me I was a burden, a mistake someone who owed them for the privilege of sleeping under their roof. I sat on the floor of Henry's office, surrounded by evidence of betrayal so profound it rewrote my entire understanding of my childhood. They hadn't just failed to love me. They'd actively profited from my father's death while treating his child like garbage. But this inheritance was only the beginning. Henry had left her the keys to an empire she didn't even know existed yet. The discovery of what the Brooks family had done to me lit a fire in my chest that burned for weeks. But I didn't let it consume me. Instead, I channeled that rage into something productive. Henry had given me tools, knowledge, and resources. The best way to honor his memory wasn't to wallow in anger about the past, but to build something so substantial that the people who'd stolen from me would become completely irrelevant. I was 30 years old, with a growing real estate portfolio and a hunger to prove that the girl they'd thrown away could build an empire they'd never touch. I started by identifying gaps in the market that larger companies ignored. Regional small businesses were being underserved by national logistics companies that prioritized big clients and treated smaller accounts like inconveniences. These businesses needed reliable supply chain services, consistent delivery schedules, and someone who actually answered the phone when problems arose. I saw an opportunity where others saw unprofitable small contracts. I launched KTB Logistics with 2 used delivery trucks purchased at auction, a bare-bones office in a converted warehouse, and a business plan I'd refined over months of research. I was driver, dispatcher, accountant, customer service, and janitor all rolled into one. I worked from 4 in the morning until 10 at night, delivering packages at dawn, making sales calls during lunch, managing routes in the afternoon, and handling bookkeeping after midnight. It was brutal, exhausting work that left me physically and mentally drained every single day. But I was good at it. Better than good. My childhood had trained me to anticipate needs before they were spoken to deliver perfection, because anything less meant punishment, to work harder than anyone else because approval was always conditional. Those survival instincts forged in a home where I was never good enough became my competitive advantage in business. I didn't just meet deadlines, I beat them. I didn't just solve problems, I anticipated them before they happened. Excellence wasn't a choice for me. It was muscle memory, survival instinct, weaponized into business success. Within 6 months, I'd built a reputation for reliability that earned me referrals. Within a year, I landed my first major contract with a regional manufacturing company that needed consistent parts delivery to 3 different facilities. The contract was worth more than I'd made in the previous 6 months combined, and it gave KTB Logistics the stability to expand. I hired my first employees, bought 3 more trucks, and moved into a larger facility. I was building something real. As KTB Logistics grew profitable, I began deploying capital the way Henry had taught me. Buy assets, not liabilities. Kimberly. His voice echoed in my memory during every investment decision I made. A fancy car is a liability. A profitable business is an asset. Always know the difference. I looked for struggling businesses with solid fundamentals, but poor management companies that were valuable underneath their operational problems. I acquired a 20% stake in a commercial cleaning company that was losing clients due to inconsistent service. I brought in a new operations manager, implemented quality controls, and within 18 months the company had tripled its client base. I sold my stake at 4 times what I'd paid. I invested in a specialty food distributor that served restaurants but had outdated logistics systems. I introduced them to technology solutions that streamlined their operations, took 15% equity, and watched the company's value climb as efficiency improved. A medical supply wholesaler, a small manufacturing firm, a commercial laundry service. Nothing glamorous or headline-worthy, just solid businesses in unglamorous industries that generated steady cash flow. I operated through holding companies and trusts, keeping my personal name off public documents and ownership records. Each investment was strategic, each business relationship was cultivated carefully, and each success was quietly reinvested into the next opportunity. By the time I turned 35, I was a multi-millionaire on paper. My real estate holdings had appreciated significantly. KTB Logistics was generating 7 figures annually, and my investment portfolio included equity stakes in a dozen profitable companies. But you wouldn't know it by looking at me. I still drove a 5-year-old sedan. I lived in a comfortable but unremarkable townhouse. I wore business casual clothes from department stores, not designer boutiques. My invisibility was strategic, learned from years of understanding that being seen meant being targeted. I turned down interviews from local business publications. I declined invitations to speak at entrepreneurship conferences. When I won a regional business award for Emerging Entrepreneur, I sent my operations manager to accept it on my behalf. I learned from watching my family that visible success attracted the wrong kind of attention, especially from people who saw your achievements as resources they could exploit. The Brooks family had taught me that lesson thoroughly. Better to build power quietly and let results speak for themselves. Instead of chasing recognition, I built influence through substance. I accepted positions on nonprofit boards where I could make genuine impact. I developed strategic partnerships with other business owners, relationships built on mutual respect and shared values rather than opportunism. I became known among people who mattered as someone sharp, fair, and formidably competent. Business leaders sought my advice. Investors wanted to partner with me. Banks competed for my accounts. I treated my employees the way I wished I'd been treated growing up. I paid fair wages, offered genuine mentorship, and created work environments where people felt valued for their contributions rather than exploited for their labor. Several of my early employees went on to start their own businesses, and I invested in some of them, creating a network of loyalty and mutual success. I was building not just wealth, but a fortress of resources, relationships, and reputation that would protect me from ever being vulnerable again. The locked box Henry had left me sat unopened in my home safe. "Open only when they come back," the engraving read. I thought about those words, often wondering who they referred to, and when this mysterious return would happen. Part of me hoped it never would. I'd built a good life, a safe life, one where my past couldn't reach me and my future was entirely in my own hands. But while Kimberly built her empire in silence, the Brooks family was crumbling and desperate people make dangerous choices. I didn't keep tabs on the Brooks family. I'd cut them out of my life completely after that night in the rain 20 years ago, and I'd never looked back. But in a small enough community, information has a way of circulating whether you seek it or not. Business contacts mentioned things in passing. Mutual acquaintances from my childhood would occasionally appear in my professional circles. And slowly over the years since Henry's death, I began hearing whispers that the perfect Brooks family facade was developing some very serious cracks. The first major fracture came when my father lost his job. He was 62, close enough to retirement that he'd been coasting for years on tenure rather than competence. When his company underwent a federal investigation for financial irregularities, his department's sloppy record-keeping and questionable expense reports made him a liability the company couldn't afford to keep. I heard about it through a business associate whose firm had done consulting work for the same corporation. "That whole department was a mess," he told me over coffee. "Inflated expenses, missing documentation, projects billed that were never completed. They cleaned house to avoid deeper scrutiny. Your father was one of about a dozen people they let go." My father wasn't directly implicated in any criminal activity, But his mediocre performance and ethical corner-cutting over decades had finally caught up with him. At 62, he was too close to retirement age to be easily rehireable, and too proud to accept the kind of entry-level positions that might have been available. I learned through the grapevine that his severance package, which should have carried them comfortably into retirement, disappeared within months due to the same poor money management that had always characterized their household. His entire identity had been wrapped up in being a successful corporate man, and without that title, he was completely unmoored, bitter, and looking for anyone to blame except himself. The second crack appeared in my mother's carefully constructed world of appearances. I found out about her debt spiral from an unexpected source, a former neighbor who now worked in retail at one of the high-end department stores my mother had frequented for years. "Your mother came in last week trying to return items without receipts," the woman told me when we ran into each other at a community event. She was really agitated, saying she needed the cash back, not store credit. Security had to get involved. It was awkward for everyone. Apparently, my mother had spent years living far beyond their means. Designer handbags she couldn't afford, weekly spa treatments that cost more than most people's grocery bills, premium gym memberships, salon appointments, luxury purchases, all made to maintain the appearance of success among her social circle. All of it funded by credit cards that were now maxed out and personal loans accumulating interest at rates that would horrify any financially literate person. When my father's income disappeared, the house of cards collapsed with stunning speed. Collection agencies started calling. Credit scores plummeted. The woman who had once thrown my rain-soaked belongings onto the lawn with such contempt was now facing repossession of her own prized possessions. But instead of taking responsibility for decades of financial recklessness, my mother apparently blamed bad luck and the economy, and your father's company treating him unfairly. I heard she was calling old friends asking for loans, selling jewelry piece by piece, and even considering a reverse mortgage on the house. Anything to avoid the reality that she'd spent money she didn't have for years to impress people who didn't actually care about her. The third and perhaps most predictable crack was Ashley. My sister was now 32 years old and had never held a job for longer than 6 months. According to mutual acquaintances who still followed her on social media, she'd spent her 20s pursuing influencer dreams that never materialized beyond a few hundred followers who were mostly family friends and bots. She'd been supported entirely by our parents living in their basement, having her bills paid while she took selfies and posted about products nobody asked her to promote. The car I'd helped her get, the one whose loan payments she'd demanded I continue making even as they threw me out, was repossessed when the payments stopped, and neither Ashley nor our parents could cover them. An eviction notice arrived from a small apartment she'd briefly rented, thinking she could finally live independently. A lawsuit followed for unpaid credit cards she'd maxed out buying equipment for her content creation career. For the first time in her entire life, nobody was rushing to rescue her, and the realization that she had zero marketable skills, zero work ethic, and zero ability to support herself hit her like a freight train. She'd been trained from childhood to be decorative and demanding, to expect that someone would always solve her problems and fund her lifestyle. Competence, self-sufficiency, resilience. These were never qualities our parents had encouraged in her, because they'd made her dependent on their approval and support. Now, at 32, she was facing adult consequences without any adult capabilities, and according to people who still saw her posts, she was spiraling into panic and rage. I learned all of this not because I was actively seeking information, but because in business and social circles people talk. They mention the Brooks family's troubles in that slightly uncomfortable way people do when they're not quite gossiping, but not quite being discreet either. Each piece of information arrived like a puzzle piece I hadn't asked for, but couldn't help assembling into a larger picture. The perfect family that had thrown me away as defective was falling apart under the weight of their own choices. My father's mediocrity and ethical flexibility had finally caught up with him. My mother's obsession with appearances and inability to live within means had created a financial disaster. My sister's lack of any real skills or work ethic had left her completely unprepared for independent adult life. Everything I'd been blamed for, every way they'd positioned me as the family's problem and failure was being revealed as projection. They were their own worst enemies, and they'd been their own worst enemies all along. I felt no satisfaction in hearing about their decline. I didn't celebrate their struggles or feel vindicated by their failures. Mostly, I felt nothing. They'd become strangers to me years ago, people I once knew who'd chosen to write me out of their story. What happened to them afterward was simply not my concern. But I should have known that desperate people don't accept responsibility quietly. I should have anticipated what would come next. And in their desperation, they remembered the daughter they threw away and decided she owed them everything. They showed up on a Saturday afternoon without warning, without invitation, and certainly without apology. I was reviewing quarterly reports from KTB Logistics in my home office when the doorbell rang insistently, the kind of aggressive ringing that signals someone who believes they have a right to immediate attention. Through my security camera feed, I saw them standing on my doorstep, father, mother, and Ashley, all wearing expressions that mixed desperation with entitlement in a way I found grimly fascinating. I considered not answering. I had every right to ignore them, to let them stand there until they finally understood that showing up unannounced at someone's home after 20 years of silence was wildly inappropriate. But curiosity won out. I wanted to see what they'd become, what desperation had done to the people who'd once held absolute power over me. I opened the door but didn't step aside to let them in. "Kimberly," my father said, as if we'd just spoken yesterday rather than 2 decades ago. "We need to talk about family responsibility. Not hello, not we're sorry, not even can we please come in. Just an immediate demand couched as obligation." My mother pushed past me without waiting for permission, walking into my living room like she owned it. "You can't just abandon your family during hard times," she said, settling onto my couch as if this were her house. Ashley followed her eyes, scanning my modest furnishings with barely concealed disappointment, clearly expecting something more impressive. "You always acted like you were better than us," Ashley said, dropping her oversized purse on my coffee table. "Well, now you can prove you actually care about family. We need your help." I closed the door slowly and turned to face them, keeping my expression carefully neutral. They'd invaded my space, my home, my carefully constructed life, and they'd done it without a shred of self-awareness about how inappropriate this was. I said nothing, just waited, watching them with the kind of detached observation Henry had taught me to use in difficult business negotiations. Let them talk. People always reveal more than they intend to when they're anxious, and you're silent. My father launched into a monologue about financial hardship, his unfair termination, the economy's collapse, the betrayal of a company he'd given decades of loyal service. He talked about the mortgage, about mounting bills, about the indignity of having to ask for help at his age. Not once did he acknowledge that his termination had been for cause, that his loyal service had included sloppy work and ethical shortcuts. In his version of events, he was a victim of corporate greed and bad timing, nothing more. My mother joined in, her voice rising with theatrical emotion. "Do you know what it's like to be humiliated in front of neighbors?" she demanded. "To have friends stop calling because they're uncomfortable with our financial situation. Your abandonment destroyed our standing in this community, Kimberly. We had to tell people you'd moved away for work, that you were too busy with your career to visit. We protected you from gossip, and this is how you repay us." The revision of history was breathtaking. In her retelling, I hadn't been thrown out with my belongings tossed onto a rain-soaked lawn. I'd moved away. They'd protected me. My absence was abandonment rather than expulsion. She'd rewritten the narrative so completely that I wondered if she actually believed this version, if she'd told the lie so many times it had become her truth. Ashley pulled out her phone and showed me a list, an actual typed list of her debts. Car loan balance, credit card statements, back rent, medical bills from an emergency room visit she'd never paid. The total was staggering, well over $30,000. "Family helps family," she said, as if this were a self-evident moral principle rather than a convenient justification for exploitation. "You're the one who always had money saved, who always acted like you were so responsible. Well, now's your chance to actually help, instead of just judging everyone else. I watched her scroll through the list, noting the designer handbag she carried a knockoff, but an expensive knockoff. I observed my father's shoes, cheap and worn, the kind you buy at discount stores when you're pretending you're not broke. I studied my mother's face, the deep lines around her mouth from years of pursing her lips in disapproval, the brittleness in her eyes that came from decades of caring more about appearances than substance. They'd aged badly, all three of them, worn down by the consequences of choices they refused to take responsibility for. My father tried a different tactic when my silence continued. "Your real father," he said, and I felt my jaw tighten at the weaponization of a man he'd never respected, would have wanted you to help family in need. He was a man who understood duty and sacrifice. Surely you want to honor his memory by doing the right thing now. The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. The man who'd raised me on stolen military benefits, who'd cashed checks meant for the daughter of a fallen soldier while treating that daughter like garbage, was now invoking my real father's memory to extract money from me. The audacity was staggering. My mother pulled out tissues and began crying theatrical sobs that I recognized from childhood as her go-to manipulation when reason failed. "We're family," she wept. "We raised you. We put a roof over your head. We fed you and clothed you and gave you opportunities. You can't just turn your back on us when we need you most. What kind of daughter does that? The kind of daughter you threw out in the rain, I thought but didn't say. The kind of daughter whose college money you stole. The kind of daughter you blamed for every problem and gave nothing but contempt." But I remained silent, letting them exhaust their ammunition while I carefully catalogued every word, every tactic, every manipulation they deployed. They talked for over an hour, circling through the same arguments with increasing desperation. Family obligation, duty, the sacrifices they'd made, how hard they'd tried, how unfair life had been to them. At no point did anyone acknowledge how they'd treated me. At no point did anyone apologize or even reference the night they'd thrown me out. In their minds, apparently, I'd simply left, and now I owed them for the childhood they'd grudgingly provided while pocketing benefits meant for my care. Finally, when they'd run out of arguments and sat looking at me with varying degrees of hope and desperation, I spoke for the first time since letting them in. "I need time to think," I said calmly. "This is a lot to process. Come back in 3 days and I'll have an answer for you." They looked confused but hopeful, interpreting my non-refusal as potential agreement. They gathered their things, my mother squeezing my hand with fake warmth, my father nodding with the satisfaction of someone who believed his argument had been compelling, Ashley already texting on her phone as she walked out. They didn't notice that I hadn't agreed to anything, hadn't promised help, hadn't shown any emotion beyond polite attention. As I closed the door behind them and watched through my security camera as they walked to their car, I saw my father high-five Ashley. They thought they'd won. They thought the scared, desperate girl they'd thrown away would cave to guilt and obligation and hand over money to solve problems they'd created through their own selfishness and incompetence. They had no idea who I'd become in the 20 years since they'd discarded me. They had no idea about the resources I controlled, the knowledge I possessed, or the evidence Henry had left me about their theft of my military benefits. They'd walked into my home with demands and left with hope, never realizing they'd just given me everything I needed to ensure they'd never hurt me again. Because this time, Kimberly wasn't the powerless girl they remembered, and they had no idea what was coming. 3 days later, they returned at exactly the time I'd specified, which told me how desperate they really were. Desperate people follow instructions. Confident people push boundaries. They rang the doorbell with less aggression this time, almost respectful, as if the 3-day wait had taught them some manners. I let them in and gestured toward the living room, where I'd deliberately arranged documents on my coffee table. Nothing too obvious, just property assessments and business correspondence positioned where curious eyes might wander. "Thank you for seeing us again," my father said, and the politeness in his voice was so foreign it sounded rehearsed. They settled onto the couch, all three of them perched on the edge of their seats with anticipation written across their faces. They thought I was going to write them a check. They thought guilt or obligation or some dormant sense of family loyalty had won out over common sense. "I've been thinking about what you said." I began watching their faces carefully. "About family, about responsibility, about what I owe." I paused, letting hope build in their expressions before continuing. "You mentioned that I should remember the opportunities you gave me, the home you provided. Do you remember that beachfront property I used to talk about when I was younger? The one I said I'd own someday?" My mother's face flickered with confusion, clearly not remembering but willing to pretend. "Of course, dear. You were always such a dreamer." "You called it a fantasy," I corrected gently. "You said I had delusions of grandeur and needed to focus on realistic goals like getting a secretary job." I pulled out a folder from the stack on the table and opened it to reveal property deeds, tax assessments, and recent appraisal documents. "I bought it 8 years ago. It's worth about $3 million now given the commercial development in the area." The silence that followed was profound. I watched my father's eyes move from my face to the documents and back again, his expression shifting from confusion to calculation in seconds. My mother reached for the papers with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the legal descriptions and property values. Ashley's mouth had actually fallen open, her phone forgotten in her lap for once. "3 million," my father repeated slowly as if testing the weight of the words. Then his face transformed, the demanding patriarch disappearing, and something ingratiating taking its place. His smile was oily, uncomfortable. "That's wonderful, Kimberly. Really wonderful. We always knew you had potential, didn't we?" He looked at my mother for confirmation. "Oh, yes," my mother said quickly, her tears from 3 days ago completely forgotten. "We always told people you were such a smart girl, so driven. Didn't we always say that?" She was rewriting history in real time, her mind already adjusting the narrative to position herself as having always believed in me. "You know," my father continued, leaning forward with false casualness, "a property like that requires proper management. Have you thought about what you'll do with it? Long-term family could help with those decisions. We have experience with real estate." This was a blatant lie. They'd never owned anything beyond their mortgaged house, but truth had never been their priority. Ashley found her voice, her eyes still wide. "Could we maybe stay there sometime, like a family vacation? It would be so good to reconnect, to spend time together as a family." The speed with which she pivoted from demanding debt payment to requesting vacation accommodations was almost impressive. My mother placed her hand over mine with theatrical tenderness. "You've done so well, sweetheart. All by yourself managing something so valuable. You must get lonely making all these big decisions alone. Have you thought about what happens to the property eventually? You know, when you're older, it would be nice to keep things in the family." I pulled my hand away slowly, deliberately. "Actually, I'm not alone in making decisions. I have advisors, attorneys, accountants, people I trust." I let that word hang in the air, trust something they'd never earned and never would. "And the beachfront property isn't really the significant part of my portfolio." The energy in the room shifted. My father sat up straighter. My mother's fake smile froze on her face. Ashley stopped scrolling through mental vacation photos and focused completely on me. "Portfolio?" my father asked carefully. "Multiple properties," I said casually, as if discussing the weather. "Some commercial real estate, some residential. And business interests, a logistics company, investment stakes, and a few other ventures. Nothing flashy, just steady income streams." I watched their faces as they processed this information, their pupils dilating slightly as possibility became probability, became certainty in their minds. "What kind of businesses?" Ashley asked, her voice almost reverent now. "Regional supply chain services mostly. Some manufacturing partnerships. A commercial cleaning company." I kept my tone modest, understating, deliberately knowing their greed would multiply whatever I said. "It keeps me comfortable." My mother's concern was transparently false, but impressively performed. "That sounds like so much to manage, Kimberly. How do you handle it all?" Surely you need help. Need family support for something so complex. My father, unable to contain himself, tried to reassert some patriarchal authority. You should really have family involved in major business decisions. These things can get complicated. Legal issues, tax implications. We should sit down with your advisors, make sure everything's structured properly to protect family interests. Family interests. Not my interests. Family interests as if they had any claim to what I'd built from nothing, while they spent money stolen from my dead father's benefits. I stood signaling the meeting was ending. They rose reluctantly, clearly wanting more information, more details, more commitment. I appreciate you coming, I said neutrally. This has been enlightening. So, about the help we discussed. My father started, but I cut him off. I need to be clear about something, I said, meeting each of their eyes in turn. The beachfront property is just one small part of what I have. I've built something significant over the years. Something substantial. I wanted you to know that. I watched comprehension dawn on their faces. This wasn't about bailing them out of temporary financial trouble. This was about wealth, real wealth. The kind of resources they'd been chasing their entire lives through. Appearances and credit cards and social climbing. And their daughter, the one they'd thrown away, the one they'd called a failure, the burden they'd expelled from their home, had it. They left in a daze, but I could hear them before they even reached their car. Through my open window, their voices carried clearly. Did you hear that? Multiple properties? Business interests. She's loaded, Ashley said, her voice high with excitement. We need to be strategic about this, my father replied. She's our daughter. We have rights. Family has rights to family assets. I'll start being nicer to her, my mother said. We need to rebuild the relationship. Make her see that we're valuable, that she needs us. Their conversation faded as they drove away. But I'd heard enough. They weren't chastened by the revelation of my success. They weren't impressed or proud. They were calculating, planning, scheming how to position themselves to access what I'd built. Just as they'd once positioned themselves to access military benefits meant for a dead soldier's child. I walked to my home office and unlocked the safe where Henry's mysterious box still waited. Open only when they come back, the inscription read. Well, they'd come back. And now they'd revealed exactly who they still were, the same greedy, manipulative people who'd stolen from me once, and would try to do it again if given the chance. I pulled out my phone and called my attorney. I need you to prepare some documents for me, I said. And I need you to pull everything we have on military survivor benefits fraud from the Brooks case files Henry compiled. It's time. The trap was baited, and they'd taken it eagerly, their greed overriding any sense of caution or decency. And I knew with certainty they wouldn't stop until they'd tried to take everything, which meant it was time to take everything from them. The first move was surgical and completely legal. Years ago, when I'd been building my investment portfolio, I'd acquired a struggling debt collection agency at Henry's suggestion. Consumer debt portfolios can be purchased for pennies on the dollar, he'd explained. If you run it ethically, offering payment plans instead of harassment, working with people instead of against them, you can rebuild both the business and people's financial lives. I'd transformed that agency into a profitable operation that treated debtors with dignity while still recovering debts effectively. Now that same agency gave me access to portfolios of unpaid consumer debt that larger creditors had written off and sold in bulk. I instructed my operations manager to identify any accounts connected to the Brooks family name. Within 48 hours, I had a report on my desk. My mother owed $32,000 across 4 maxed-out credit cards that had been charged off and sold to various collection agencies. For $8,000.25 on the dollar, I could legally purchase her entire debt portfolio. I made the purchase through Summit Financial Recovery, one of several subsidiary names my agency operated under. The transaction was routine legal and gave me complete authority to restructure payment terms, negotiate settlements, or pursue collections through liens and wage garnishment if necessary. My mother would receive a letter informing her that her debt had been purchased by a new creditor and that she needed to contact them to establish a payment plan. She'd have no idea that the company now holding her financial future was controlled by the daughter she'd once thrown into the rain. The letter went out on a Monday. By Wednesday, my phone rang with a call from an unknown number that I let go to voicemail. My mother's voice was tight with panic. "Kimberly, I don't know if you can help, but I received this letter from a collection agency, and I'm terrified. They're talking about liens and legal action. Could you possibly loan me the money to settle this? I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but family helps family in emergencies." I didn't call back. The time for her defining what constituted family emergency had long passed. The second move targeted the asset they'd already begun treating as communally owned, my beachfront property. Through my attorney, I filed documentation with the county explicitly restricting access to the property. The paperwork included a detailed list of individuals prohibited from entering the premises, naming my father, mother, and Ashley specifically. No trespassing orders were posted. Security was notified. The property management company I used received clear instructions that under no circumstances were these 3 people to be granted access for any reason at any time. My mother called again 2 days later, her voice saccharine sweet. "Kimberly, honey, I was wondering if perhaps we could visit that beautiful beach house of yours this weekend, just for a day trip. It would mean so much to your father and me, and Ashley is just dying to see it. It would be such a lovely way to reconnect as a family." "No," I said simply. "That won't be possible." The sweetness evaporated instantly. "What do you mean, no? It's just a weekend visit. Don't be cruel, Kimberly. We're your family. You can't seriously be this vindictive over past disagreements." Past disagreements. That's what she called throwing me out of their home with my belongings soaked in rain. Past disagreements. "The property isn't available," I said calmly. "I need to go now." I ended the call before she could respond. My father called an hour later, his voice hard with authority he no longer possessed over me. "What's this nonsense about us not being allowed on your property? I don't know what kind of power trip you're on, Kimberly, but that beach house came from Henry's money, and Henry was only connected to this family through us. We have legal standing to contest his will if you're going to be unreasonable about family access to family assets." The legal ignorance was stunning. Henry's will had been executed, properly witnessed, and filed years ago. My father had zero legal standing to contest anything, and the fact that he was threatening to try revealed how little he understood about law and how much he overestimated his position. "You're welcome to consult an attorney about that," I said evenly. "Though I should mention that contesting a will requires proof of undue influence, mental incapacity, or fraud. You'd need standing to even file such a contest, which you don't have. But by all means, waste money on legal consultations if it makes you feel better." I hung up before he could sputter out a response. Over the following weeks, their communication escalated in frequency and desperation, while my responses became increasingly sparse. I watched through the careful documentation my attorney kept as they spiraled. Text messages at all hours, voicemails that grew progressively more accusatory, emails that mixed guilt-tripping with vague legal threats. Each message was saved, time-stamped, and filed. Ashley, in her infinite wisdom, decided social media was the answer. She posted a series of vague but pointed statements about family betrayal and people who forget where they came from and blood being thicker than water until money gets involved. She never named me directly, but the implication was clear to anyone who knew our family situation. I screenshot every post, every comment, building a record of harassment that might prove useful later. My mother, meanwhile, began telling neighbors and former family friends that I'd been manipulated by that man Henry and was mentally unstable and making poor decisions about family relationships. I learned about this through business associates who'd heard the rumors and asked if everything was all right. Each rumor, each piece of gossip, each defamatory statement was documented by my attorney's investigator. My father consulted with a lawyer about contesting Henry's inheritance exactly as I'd predicted. The attorney apparently explained that he had no legal basis for such action, But my father insisted on having the consultation anyway, spending money he didn't have on a fantasy of reclaiming assets that were never his. I knew about the consultation within 24 hours. The attorney community in our region was small and word traveled. Through all of this, I remained almost completely silent. I responded to perhaps 1 in every 10 communications and then only with brief neutral statements. I'm unable to help with that. That won't be possible. I have nothing further to discuss. My silence was strategic, deliberate. Desperate people make mistakes when they're ignored. They escalate. They create evidence of their own harassment. They reveal their true motives and character in ways that calm responded to people never do. I watched them spiral with the detachment of a scientist observing a predictable experiment. Remove the perceived resource, in this case, access to my money and assets, and watch the reaction. They'd shown me in that first meeting exactly who they were. People who saw me as a means to an end, who calculated my value in dollar signs, who believed family was something you could invoke to extract resources you hadn't earned. Now they were showing the world that same character, creating a documented trail of entitlement harassment and manipulation that would be invaluable when the time came for the real confrontation. My attorney called one evening with an update. "They're getting reckless," he said. "Your mother's defamation is escalating. Your father's made 3 separate calls to my office demanding I talk sense into you. Your sister's social media posts are bordering on legally actionable. They're building our case for us." "Let them," I said calmly. "Desperate people always do." I unlocked Henry's box that night and read through the documents again. Evidence of military benefits fraud, photocopied checks, false affidavits, Henry's meticulous investigation spanning years. And at the bottom, a sealed envelope I hadn't noticed before, marked with a single word, truth. I opened it carefully and found a document that made my hands shake as I read. A birth certificate, DNA test results. Henry's handwritten note explaining something I'd never suspected, never even imagined. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about Henry, about my own identity was about to change. But what the Brooks family didn't know was that I wasn't just blocking them. I was about to reveal a connection that would shatter their world. The document from Henry's sealed envelope sat on my desk for hours while I processed its implications, but I couldn't dwell on personal revelations when there was strategic work to be done. I'd received an email from my investment fund manager earlier that week, mentioning that one of our portfolio companies, a regional manufacturing conglomerate, was holding a shareholder meeting to discuss corporate governance reforms. The company name had seemed vaguely familiar, and when I cross-referenced it against my father's employment history, the connection became clear. This was the parent company that had acquired his former employer 3 years ago. I made a call to my fund manager. "The Riverside Industries meeting next month. I want detailed background on why we're invested and what governance issues they're addressing." He sent over a briefing package within hours. Our fund held a modest but significant stake enough to warrant board-level attention when we made requests. The governance discussion centered on implementing stricter financial controls and transparency measures following discoveries of irregularities in several departments acquired through their expansion strategy. My father's former division was specifically mentioned as an example of the problematic practices they were working to eliminate. "Can I access the investigation reports as a stakeholder?" I asked my attorney. "Given the size of your fund's investment and the fact that these reports were compiled for governance purposes, yes. They're not public, but major investors have legitimate interest in understanding fiduciary risks." The files arrived in a secured digital format 2 days later. I spent an evening reading through investigation reports that detailed systematic financial misconduct across multiple departments, including the one my father had managed for 15 years. The findings were damning in their specificity. Expense reports inflated by 30 to 40%, with personal purchases disguised as business costs. Client billings for services never performed with projects marked complete when they'd barely been started. False reporting to senior management about project statuses, delays blamed on vendors or clients, rather than department incompetence. My father's name appeared throughout the reports, sometimes as the manager who should have caught these issues, other times as a direct participant. He'd personally approved expenses that were clearly fraudulent. He'd signed off on project completions that investigation later proved were nowhere near finished. He'd misrepresented budget needs to cover past overspending, creating a cycle of deception that had gone on for years. The company had chosen not to press criminal charges, the report noted, because prosecution would require publicly admitting how long the misconduct had gone undetected, which would damage shareholder confidence and potentially trigger lawsuits. Instead, they'd quietly terminated everyone involved, paid them minimal severance to avoid wrongful termination claims, and implemented the new controls to prevent future occurrences. My father wasn't a victim of corporate politics or bad luck. He was a mediocre manager who'd cut ethical corners for years, believing himself too clever to get caught and too valuable to be fired. When the investigation finally came, he'd been exposed as exactly what he was: someone who blamed others for his failures while taking credit for others' successes, who believed rules were for other people, who saw his position as license to exploit rather than responsibility to lead. Reading those reports, I saw the same man who'd called me every mistake this family ever made, while he was systematically stealing from his employer and defrauding clients. The same man who'd claimed I was irresponsible and immature while he was falsifying business documents. The same man who'd thrown me out of his house for losing my job to sabotage, while his own termination was for documented fraud he'd spent years committing. The shareholder meeting invitation arrived in my inbox 3 days later. Typically, I sent my fund manager to represent our interests at these meetings, preferring to remain behind the scenes. But this meeting was different. This meeting was an opportunity to step into a space my father had been expelled from, to sit in rooms with people who knew exactly what he'd done and why he'd been fired. I called my fund manager. "I'll be attending the Riverside Industries meeting personally." "Really? You usually avoid these. Any particular reason?" "I want to understand their governance reforms firsthand. We're talking about a significant investment, and I want to hear directly from leadership how they're addressing the cultural issues that allowed those problems to develop." It was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I wanted my presence known. I wanted word to spread through business networks that Kimberly Brooks, the daughter of a disgraced manager terminated for cause, was now an investor significant enough to warrant board attention. I wanted my father's former colleagues, the ones he'd stayed in touch with, the ones he'd complained to about being unfairly treated, to know that his daughter was being invited into rooms he'd never enter again. I wouldn't mention him by name. I wouldn't need to. My mere presence would send the message I'd succeeded where he'd failed, and I'd done it through integrity rather than shortcuts, through actual competence, rather than deception and blame shifting. The meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks out. I informed my attorney of my plans. "You're going public," he observed. "Once you attend that meeting as a significant investor, your privacy goes away. Business reporters will write about it. Your name will appear in industry publications. The Brooks family will see it." "I know," I said calmly. "It's time. And you're ready for what comes next. Because once they know how much influence you actually have, their desperation will turn into something uglier." I thought about the documents Henry had left me about the birth certificate, and DNA results I still hadn't fully processed about the evidence of military benefits fraud that would devastate my family if made public. I thought about my father's inflated sense of authority, and my mother's desperate attempts to maintain appearances, and Ashley's entitled demands for money she'd never earned. "Let them come," I said. "I'm not hiding anymore." And when I walked into that boardroom, I would step into a spotlight that would change everything, because my true identity was about to become public knowledge. The morning of the shareholder meeting, I stood in front of my mirror, longer than usual, choosing a tailored charcoal suit that projected quiet authority without ostentation. Henry had once told me that real power dresses for the room it's in, not the room it wants to impress. I pulled my hair back into a professional knot, applied minimal makeup, and studied my reflection. I looked like exactly what I was: a 38-year-old business owner who'd earned her seat through competence and strategic thinking. No apology, no pretense, just capability made visible. The Riverside Industries headquarters occupied a modern glass building in the business district, the kind of architecture designed to project transparency and forward-thinking values. I arrived 15 minutes early, signed in at security, and was escorted to the executive floor. The boardroom was impressive. Massive windows overlooking the city, a polished conference table that could seat 30, and the subtle markers of corporate success displayed on walls and shelves. I was the first investor representative to arrive. Board members and company executives filtered in over the next 10 minutes, most offering polite nods but clearly assuming I was an assistant or junior associate sent to take notes. One executive actually asked me if I could get him coffee. I smiled and said, "I'm sure there's a carafe by the door," and watched confusion flicker across his face when I didn't move to serve him. The chairman called the meeting to order at precisely 9 o'clock. He welcomed everyone, ran through procedural formalities, and then began introducing the stakeholder representatives present. When he reached my name, the room's energy shifted noticeably. "And we're particularly pleased to have Ms. Kimberly Brooks here today representing the Hartford Investment Group. Ms. Brooks's fund holds a significant position in Riverside Industries, and we value her perspective on our governance initiatives." Heads turned. The executive who'd asked me for coffee went slightly red. Hands extended across the table for introductions that should have happened when I first entered. People straightened in their chairs, suddenly attentive, in a way they hadn't been when they'd thought I was just someone's assistant. I shook hands calmly, meeting each person's eyes with the quiet confidence Henry had taught me to project. I'd earned this seat not through family connections or inherited wealth, but through years of building something substantial from nothing. The meeting proceeded through several agenda items: quarterly reports, operational updates, strategic planning discussions. I listened carefully, taking notes, asking occasional clarifying questions that demonstrated I'd done my homework on the company's position and challenges. When the discussion turned to governance reforms and financial controls, I saw my opening. "If I may," I said during a pause in the conversation, and the chairman nodded for me to continue. "I appreciate the comprehensive controls being implemented going forward, but I'd like to propose we also commission an independent audit of past financial irregularities, with findings made available to major stakeholders. We cannot demand accountability from our workforce if we don't hold leadership past and present to the same standards. Past issues must be transparently addressed to move forward with genuine integrity, not just the appearance of reform." There was a moment of silence as board members processed what I was suggesting. It wasn't accusatory, wasn't personal, but it was direct. I was proposing they shine a light on exactly the kind of conduct that had gotten my father and others fired, but frame it as institutional accountability rather than individual blame. The chairman leaned forward. "That's a fair point, Ms. Brooks. We've focused heavily on preventing future issues, but perhaps haven't adequately addressed communicating about past problems. An independent audit would certainly reinforce our commitment to transparency." The board agreed, several members nodding with what looked like genuine respect for the suggestion. No one mentioned specific names or departments, but everyone in that room who understood the company's recent history knew this would affect the previous regime, the managers who'd been quietly removed the culture of corner-cutting that had been tolerated for too long. I just ensured that my father's misconduct would be documented in an independent audit report available to major stakeholders. Not as revenge, but as institutional accountability. The distinction mattered to me even if the outcome was the same. After the meeting adjourned, several board members approached me with business cards and invitations to lunch, but it was the business journalist waiting in the lobby who would change everything. She introduced herself as writing for Regional Commerce Review and asked if I had a few minutes to discuss my perspective on corporate governance and ethical investing. I almost declined out of habit, but then remembered what my attorney had said. "You're going public." I agreed to a brief conversation, expecting maybe a paragraph mention in some industry newsletter nobody read. The article appeared 3 days later, not buried in the business section, but featured prominently, "Young Investor Brings Fresh Perspective to Regional Commerce." The piece highlighted my background building KTB Logistics from 2 trucks to a multi-million-dollar operation, strategic property investments. My reputation among business leaders as someone who combined sharp financial acumen with genuine ethical standards. The journalist had done her research interviewing several of my business associates who spoke about my integrity and competence. The article included a photo from the shareholder meeting me speaking at the conference table, looking professional and confident. Within 24 hours, it had been shared across local business networks and social media. Within 48 hours, 3 other publications had picked it up with their own commentary. My inbox filled with interview requests, speaking invitations, and partnership proposals. The invisibility I'd carefully cultivated for years evaporated in days. I was now publicly associated with my business success in a way that couldn't be hidden or downplayed. The fortress I'd built in shadow was now standing in full sunlight, and everyone could see it, including the Brooks family. My phone rang 2 hours after the article posted. My father's number. I let it go to voicemail. His message was cold and bitter. I saw the article. Very impressive, Kimberly. You've certainly made something of yourself. I wonder what those business reporters would think if they knew the full story of where your money really came from. We should talk. Soon. The threat was clear, though empty. He had no story to tell except his own failure and my legitimate success. But his tone told me something important, seeing my face in that publication reading about my achievements, watching me succeed in spaces he'd been expelled from, had broken something in him. And when my father saw his daughter's face in that business article, something inside him snapped, because if he couldn't succeed, he'd make sure I couldn't either. My father's threatening voicemail was just the beginning. Over the following week, I began hearing echoes of a whisper campaign he'd launched, with the kind of obsessive energy he'd never applied to legitimate work. A business associate called to ask with uncomfortable delicacy if there was any truth to concerns about how I'd acquired my initial capital. Another mentioned hearing that I'd taken advantage of an elderly mentor. A third said they'd been contacted by someone claiming to be my father, expressing worry about my sudden wealth and erratic behavior. The pattern was clear and clumsy. My father was calling anyone whose contact information he could find, former colleagues from his own career, business owners in the region, people mentioned in the article about me, and spinning a narrative designed to damage my reputation. He positioned himself as a concerned parent, worried about his daughter who'd manipulated a vulnerable old man to inherit money she didn't deserve. He suggested my success was built on fraud, on exploitation, on taking advantage of Henry's supposed senility in his final years. The accusations were baseless and easily disproven. Henry had been sharp as a tack until the day he died, with medical records and attorney attestations to prove it. But my father wasn't concerned with truth. He was concerned with creating doubt, with planting seeds of suspicion that might slow my business relationships or damage my credibility. It was vindictive, desperate, and entirely in character for a man who'd spent his career blaming others for his failures. I documented every contact, every rumor, every whispered accusation that made its way back to me. My attorney kept meticulous records, building a file that might prove useful if the harassment escalated to legally actionable levels. But my father wasn't working alone. My mother had enlisted in his campaign with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found a project to channel her bitterness into. They worked their social circle systematically, the neighborhood association, their church community, the country club they could no longer afford but still occasionally visited. They told anyone who would listen that I'd abandoned my family in their time of need, that I'd stolen from Henry's estate, that I refused to help while living in wealth I didn't deserve. Some people dismissed them immediately, recognizing the transparent envy and entitlement behind their complaints. But others, particularly those who'd known the Brooks family for decades and had never met me, believed the narrative. The Brooks family had lived in the community for 40 years. I'd been absent for 20. In that calculation, their word carried more weight than mine, simply by virtue of presence and familiarity. I started receiving pointed comments from people I barely knew. At a community business event, a woman I'd never met approached me with false concern. "I heard about the difficulties with your family," she said, her tone dripping with judgment. "It must be hard having success while your parents struggle. Some people would feel obligated to help, but I suppose everyone has their own values. The implication was clear. I was the villain in the story my parents were telling. Several people who'd seen my business article now viewed me with suspicion rather than respect. The narrative my parents had crafted was designed to make my success seem ill-gotten and my refusal to bail them out seem cruel. They were rewriting history in real time, transforming themselves from the family who'd thrown me out into the family I'd heartlessly abandoned. My attorney called on a Friday afternoon with news that made my jaw tighten. "Your father consulted with a lawyer about contesting Henry's will. The attorney he spoke with is a colleague of mine, not someone I'm close with, but we're in the same professional circles. Apparently your father is claiming elder abuse, arguing that Henry wasn't mentally competent when he made you his beneficiary, and that you manipulated him into leaving you everything." "That's absurd," I said flatly. "Henry had full mental capacity. His attorney can confirm that, his doctors can confirm that, and anyone who knew him in his final years can confirm that." "I know. The lawyer he consulted apparently told him the same thing, that he has virtually no chance of success. Henry had cognitive assessments as part of his estate planning. The will was properly executed with witnesses. You were a legal adult when you inherited, and there's a clear paper trail showing Henry's deliberate planning over years. But your father doesn't seem to care about winning. He filed preliminary paperwork anyway." I felt cold rage settle in my chest. He wants to harass me into giving him money. That's my assessment. The filing forces you to respond formally through legal channels, which cost you time and money even though the case will be dismissed. It's legal harassment, essentially. A nuisance suit designed to pressure you into settlement rather than fighting it. File a response denying all claims and requesting sanctions for frivolous litigation, I said. And prepare a countersuit for harassment and defamation. I'm done being patient with people who mistake kindness for weakness. Understood. I'll have the paperwork ready by Monday. After I hung up, I sat in my office as afternoon light slanted through the windows, thinking about the man who'd raised me with contempt and was now trying to destroy me with lies. He couldn't stand that I'd succeeded where he'd failed. He couldn't tolerate that the daughter he'd called every mistake this family ever made had built something substantial while he'd been fired for incompetence and fraud. So he'd decided that if he couldn't succeed, he'd make sure I couldn't either. It was petty, vindictive, and entirely predictable. Bullies always escalate when their targets refuse to submit. My father had expected me to cave to guilt or family obligation or social pressure. When I didn't, he'd move to active attack, trying to tear down what he couldn't control. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Henry had anticipated exactly this scenario. That the sealed documents I'd been carefully reviewing contained not just evidence of their past fraud, but meticulous documentation of their character, their history, their pattern of manipulation and exploitation. I unlocked my safe and pulled out Henry's box again, removing the files I'd been organizing. Birth certificates, DNA test results, military benefits fraud documentation, witness statements, financial records, and one more envelope I hadn't yet opened marked with Henry's handwriting, "For when they try to destroy you, and they will." I opened it carefully and began to read. With each page, my understanding of the full scope of what Henry had left me deepened. This wasn't just defensive documentation. This was a complete strategic roadmap for dismantling everything they'd built on lies. But while my father plotted legal attacks, he had no idea that I was about to receive documents that would destroy him, and they came from beyond the grave. The envelope Henry had marked, "For when they try to destroy you," contained a handwritten note in his distinctive, precise script. "Kimberly, if you're reading this, they've shown you exactly who they are. I'm sorry I'm not there to protect you in person, but I can protect you with truth. Everything you need is documented. Everything you remember is validated. And everything they try to claim about you or me can be disproven with facts. You were never the problem. You were never the mistake. You were always worthy of love, and I'm sorry it took me so long to show you that properly. The rest of the documents are with my attorney to be released only when you're ready. Trust yourself. Trust what I've left you. And remember, the truth is always stronger than lies, even when the liars are louder." I called Henry's attorney the next morning. He arrived at my office that afternoon with a leather document case that looked like it had been stored in his firm's vault for years. Mr. Sawyer left very specific instructions, he explained, setting the case on my conference table. If the Brooks family ever attempted legal action regarding his estate or your inheritance, I was to provide you with these materials immediately. He updated them annually right up until 6 months before his death. He wanted you protected, Ms. Brooks. That was his paramount concern. He opened the case and began laying out folders, each labeled with meticulous detail. The first set contained Henry's medical records from his final decade comprehensive cognitive assessments performed annually by a neuropsychologist, all showing normal mental function and capacity. There were letters from his primary care physician attesting to his mental acuity, signed affidavits from his attorney confirming Henry understood all estate planning decisions, and even video recordings of Henry explaining his reasoning for leaving everything to me, dated and witnessed. Your father's claim of mental incapacity is dead on arrival, the attorney said bluntly. Mr. Sawyer anticipated this exact argument and spent years building documentation to refute it. Any judge who sees this file will dismiss the contest immediately. The second set of folders made my hands shake as I opened them. Military death benefits documentation. After my biological father's death in service, the Brooks family had filed paperwork with the Department of Veterans Affairs claiming they were providing care for his dependent child, me, and had received monthly dependency and indemnity compensation meant to support my upbringing. There were also educational benefits, survivor health care coverage, and a substantial life insurance payout that should have been held in trust for me. Henry's investigators had obtained copies of everything. Checks made out to my father, Mr. Brooks, with DIC benefits for dependent child in the memo line. Bank statements showing these deposits for years deposited and spent on luxury purchases. Ashley's activities, home renovations. The amounts were staggering. Over 15 years, they'd collected more than $200,000 in benefits meant specifically for my care and education. But the fraud went deeper. The paperwork they'd filed with the VA included false affidavits claiming financial hardship statements that they were covering all my expenses out of their own limited resources. Even forged documentation of educational costs they claimed to be paying on my behalf. In reality, I'd worked part-time jobs to buy my own school supplies. I'd worn secondhand clothes while Ashley got new wardrobes. They'd taken government money meant to care for a fallen soldier's child and spent it on themselves while treating that child like an unwanted burden. Henry's notes explained that he'd discovered this fraud within a year of my arriving at the shelter, but he'd chosen not to tell me. She's been through enough, he wrote. Knowing the depth of their betrayal would only add trauma to trauma. Better to document everything, build an unassailable case, and let her decide what to do with this information when she's strong enough to handle it without being destroyed by it. The third set of folders was the hardest to read. Henry had documented my childhood through the eyes of people who'd witnessed but couldn't stop the neglect and emotional abuse. Teacher reports expressing concern about a child who came to school hungry and wearing clothes that didn't fit. Neighbor statements about hearing Mr. Brooks shouting at me about seeing me doing yard work in the heat while Ashley played in the sprinkler. School counselor notes documenting conversations where I'd deflected questions about home life, protecting the family that was hurting me. There were medical records showing I'd been underweight through most of elementary school, falling below growth curve percentiles until I started eating lunch at school through a free meal program. There were photographs, I don't know how Henry obtained them, showing bruises on my arms and legs, the kind you get from being grabbed roughly or pushed into furniture carefully placed where they'd be covered by clothing. Never hit directly, never marked in ways that would trigger mandatory reporting, but hurt nonetheless. Shelter staff had provided statements about my condition when I arrived at 17, malnourished, wearing clothes too small, carrying everything I owned in a single garbage bag. They described a teenager who was eerily self-sufficient and apologized constantly for taking up space, exhibiting classic signs of long-term emotional abuse and neglect. Reading through these files, I saw my childhood validated by objective observers. Every memory I'd questioned, every moment I'd wondered if I was being too sensitive or remembering things worse than they were, it was all confirmed by people who'd seen it happen and documented their concerns. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't exaggerating. The Brooks family had systematically neglected and emotionally abused me, while collecting government money meant for my care. Henry had built a case so comprehensive that any claim they'd loved and cared for me would be obliterated the moment these documents entered legal proceedings. He'd given me complete legal protection, and if I chose to use it, the power to destroy them financially and criminally. But there was one more envelope at the bottom of the case, sealed with red wax, and marked in Henry's handwriting, "The truth about your father." My hands trembled as I broke the seal. But among all these files there was one sealed envelope marked, "The truth about your father," and inside was a revelation that would change everything I believed about my identity. The red wax seal broke with a soft crack, and I pulled out pages written in Henry's careful handwriting, the ink slightly faded, but still perfectly legible. My heart was already racing before I read the first line, some part of me knowing that whatever this envelope contained would fundamentally change my understanding of everything I thought I knew about my life. "Kimberly, my daughter, and yes, you are my daughter in every way, including blood." I stopped breathing, read the line again. The words didn't change. "I'm writing this because you deserve to know the truth about who you are and where you came from, but I'm sealing it because I believe you should learn this truth when you're strong enough to carry it. If you're reading this now, it means I'm gone, and it means the Brooks family has shown you exactly who they are. I'm sorry I won't be there to hold your hand through this revelation, but know that every word here is truth, documented and provable, and that you were loved, truly, deeply loved from the moment you came into this world." My hands shook as I continued reading, Henry's voice clear in my mind, as if he were sitting across from me, finally telling me the story he'd kept locked away for my entire life. He and my mother Sarah had met when he was stationed at a base near her hometown. She was 19, beautiful, and working as a clerk at the base commissary. They fell in love quickly, the kind of love that felt inevitable and right. When Henry deployed, Sarah was already pregnant, but they'd made plans. He would finish his tour, they would marry, and they would build a life together. It wasn't the life her family wanted for her. Henry was just a young soldier with no family money and uncertain prospects, but it was the life they wanted for themselves. Sarah's family had other plans. While Henry was overseas, they pressured her relentlessly to marry someone appropriate, someone with a stable civilian career and the right social connections. The man who would become my legal father, Mr. Brooks, was a business associate's son, ambitious and presentable, exactly the kind of son-in-law Sarah's family desired. Under enormous pressure, isolated and pregnant and terrified, Sarah agreed to marry him. The wedding took place 4 months before I was born. Henry came home from deployment to find Sarah married to another man and dying from complications of childbirth. I'd survived, but she hadn't made it through the emergency surgery. Henry's letter described going to the hospital, being turned away by Sarah's family, being told he had no rights and no place in their daughter's life, or the life of the child she'd born. They told him Sarah had married Mr. Brooks before getting pregnant, that the child was legally Brooks's daughter, and that Henry needed to accept reality and move on. But Henry had documentation letters Sarah had written him, photographs of them together, even a letter from Sarah's best friend confirming the timeline. He consulted with a military attorney who told him he had grounds for a paternity claim. Determined to claim his daughter, Henry went to the Brooks home to present his evidence and demand custody rights. "What happened next," Henry wrote, "is something I've never spoken about to anyone except my attorney, and I'm trusting you with this truth now because you need to understand what kind of man raised you, Mr. Brooks agreed to meet Henry at a military storage facility, ostensibly to discuss the situation privately, away from Sarah's grieving family. But when Henry arrived, Brooks attacked him with a metal pipe, striking him in the head and then pushing him down a concrete stairwell. Henry was found hours later by a night security guard unconscious and bleeding. He spent weeks in the hospital with a severe traumatic brain injury that caused memory loss, cognitive impairment, and months of recovery. By the time Henry regained his faculties and could piece together what had happened, 6 months had passed. My birth certificate had been altered, listing Brooks as my father. Legal adoption paperwork had been filed and approved. Henry consulted attorneys, but they told him the same thing: he'd lost critical time, he had no memory of the attack to present as evidence, and Brooks now had legal standing as my father. A custody battle would be expensive, lengthy, and likely unsuccessful. His military benefits and savings were depleted from medical bills. He was facing the choice between bankrupting himself for a small chance at custody or finding another way to protect his daughter. "I chose to wait," Henry wrote. "I chose to watch over you from a distance to be ready for the moment when you might need me. I attended your school events from the back of auditoriums. I volunteered at programs you participated in. I made sure I knew you were at least physically safe, even if I couldn't protect you from the emotional damage they were inflicting. I saw every birthday they forgot, every achievement they dismissed, every time they made you feel worthless. I saw my daughter being raised by a man who'd stolen her and a family that treated her like a burden rather than the precious gift she was." Henry described the agony of watching me suffer, of seeing me become smaller and quieter and more invisible with each passing year, of knowing he couldn't intervene without potentially making things worse. He'd consulted Child Protective Services, but emotional neglect without physical abuse was nearly impossible to prove and rarely resulted in removal from the home. He'd considered kidnapping me, but knew that would make him a criminal and likely result in him losing me forever. When you appeared at that shelter at 17, he wrote, "I knew it was finally time. You'd freed yourself from them, and now I could finally be the father I'd always wanted to be. But I couldn't tell you the truth. Then you were so fragile, so wounded, and I was afraid that learning your entire identity was a lie would break something in you that I needed intact for you to survive. So I told you I'd known your father, which was true. I told you I'd promised to watch over his family, which was true. I just didn't tell you that I was that father, and you were the daughter I'd been watching over since the day you were born." Henry explained that he'd planned to tell me when I turned 30, believing that by then I would be stable enough, successful enough, healed enough to absorb the truth without being destroyed by it. But his health had declined faster than expected, and he'd made the difficult choice to seal this letter rather than burden me with it before I was ready. "You are my daughter Kimberly, my blood, my heart, my greatest pride. Every success you've achieved, every kindness you've shown, despite the cruelty you endured, every moment of strength you've demonstrated, all of it makes me proud beyond words. The Brooks family stole you from me legally, but they could never steal what truly mattered: the bond between a father and his child. The love I carried for you every single day, and the legacy I'm leaving you now. You owe them nothing. You never did. You are mine, and I am yours, and that truth is unbreakable." The letter ended with instructions on where to find DNA test results. He'd had done tissue samples from his medical records, and samples he'd taken from my hairbrush years ago, processed through a private laboratory and stored with his attorney. The results confirmed what his letter claimed: Henry was my biological father with 99.9% certainty. I sat in my office as afternoon faded to evening, tears streaming down my face, the letter clutched in my hands. My entire life had been a lie. The man who'd raised me wasn't my father. He was the man who'd stolen me from my father. The man who'd saved me at 17 wasn't just a kind mentor. He was my actual father, who'd been waiting 13 years for the chance to finally protect his daughter properly. Every moment of kindness Henry had shown me took on new meaning. Every lesson he'd taught, every opportunity he'd given, every word of encouragement. It wasn't charity or mentorship. It was paternal love finally allowed to express itself. He'd watched me suffer for 17 years, unable to intervene, and then spent the next 13 years trying to give me everything he'd been prevented from giving me before. And as tears streamed down my face, I realized my entire life had been a lie, but Henry's love had always been the one true thing. I sat with Henry's letter for hours, reading and rereading it, until the words were burned into my memory. The man who'd saved me at 17, who'd taught me everything I knew about business and self-worth, who'd left me the foundation to build a life of security and purpose. He was my father, my real father, the father who'd been stolen from me by violence and legal manipulation, who'd watched me suffer from a distance for 17 years because the system had failed to protect his rights as a parent. Henry's attorney returned the next morning with more documents. "There's something else Mr. Sawyer wanted you to have," he said, opening another folder. A second trust that he established separately from the primary estate. He kept it completely isolated to protect it from any potential legal challenges to his will. The portfolio he laid out was staggering in its scope and sophistication. Henry had been investing methodically for decades, building positions in regional companies that were solid but unsexy manufacturing firms, distribution networks, commercial property developments. He held minority stakes in a dozen different enterprises, none large enough to require public disclosure, but collectively worth millions. There were commercial real estate holdings across 3 states' properties he'd purchased strategically and held long-term as values appreciated. There was a meticulously managed stock portfolio diversified and rebalanced quarterly, showing the patient discipline of someone who understood that wealth was built through consistency rather than speculation. The total value of this trust, combined with the primary estate you inherited and the businesses you've built yourself, puts your net worth at approximately $15 million, the attorney said matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing the weather rather than a sum of money that would have been incomprehensible to the girl who'd slept in a shelter at 17. $15 million. Henry had spent his life building security for a daughter he couldn't claim publicly, creating layers of protection and opportunity so that I would never be vulnerable to the people who'd hurt us both. Every investment was legitimate, documented, legally unassailable. He'd given me not just money, but power. The kind of power that meant I would never have to ask permission, never have to accept crumbs, never have to tolerate abuse from people who believed they had leverage over me. "There's one more asset I should mention." The attorney continued, pulling out another file. "Mr. Sawyer purchased a debt collection agency about 8 years ago, Summit Financial Recovery. It was struggling at the time, employing aggressive tactics that were legal but ethically questionable. He restructured it to focus on payment plans and rehabilitation rather than harassment. It's now quite profitable and handles various consumer debt portfolios purchased from creditors who've written off accounts." I recognized the name immediately. Summit Financial Recovery was the agency that had sent my mother the letter about her restructured debt, the agency I'd used to purchase her credit card obligations. "I own that company," I said slowly. "I've been using it for acquisitions." "Technically, you own the holding company that owns Summit," the attorney clarified. "Mr. Sawyer set it up that way deliberately. He wanted you to have authority over collection practices and the ability to purchase specific debt portfolios if necessary. It gave him, and now you, strategic positioning regarding anyone who might try to financially manipulate you." The implications crystallized. Henry had acquired a debt collection agency and positioned it so that I would have legal authority over the collection terms for anyone whose debts we purchased, including the Brooks family. It wasn't revenge he'd planned, it was insurance, protection in case the people who'd stolen me from him ever tried to harm me financially or use debt as leverage to control me. "He thought of everything," I whispered. "He spent your entire life thinking about how to protect you," the attorney replied gently. "Every asset, every investment, every legal structure, all of it was designed to ensure you'd be safe and secure no matter what happened. That's what fathers do, Ms. Brooks. They protect their children even when they have to do it from a distance." After the attorney left, I sat alone in my home office, surrounded by documents that told the story of a father's love expressed through strategic planning and patient sacrifice. Henry had watched me grow up from the shadows, unable to claim me, but never abandoning me. He'd built wealth specifically to give to the daughter he couldn't raise. He'd documented everything that had been done to me so that I would never be gaslit about my own experiences. He'd created legal structures that would protect me from future harm. And he'd left me a letter explaining it all, trusting that when I finally learned the truth, I would understand why he'd done things the way he had. I thought about the Brooks family, the people I'd spent 38 years believing were my blood relatives. Mr. Brooks wasn't my father. He was the man who'd attacked my real father and stolen me through legal manipulation. Mrs. Brooks wasn't just neglectful. She'd collected government money meant for my care while treating me like a burden. Ashley wasn't really my sister in any meaningful sense. She was just another child in the household loved while I was scorned. They'd built their lives on lies and fraud. They'd raised me in contempt while cashing checks meant for my support. They'd stolen my childhood, my sense of worth, my relationship with my real father. And now, desperate and broke and facing consequences of their own choices, they were trying to take from me again this time through harassment, defamation, and frivolous lawsuits. I had everything I needed to destroy them. Documentation of their military benefits. Fraud that could result in criminal charges and restitution demands. Evidence of child neglect and emotional abuse. Financial leverage through the debts they owed. And resources to fight them legally until they had nothing left. But more than revenge, I wanted justice. I wanted them to understand what they'd taken from me, what they'd stolen from Henry, what they'd destroyed through their greed and cruelty. I wanted them to know that the daughter they'd thrown away had been the daughter of a man who loved her profoundly, and that their abuse of me was an abuse of that love. I began organizing the documents, building a strategy for the confrontation I knew was coming. I would give them one chance, one opportunity to walk away, to sign away any claim to me or my life, to accept minimal help in exchange for permanent distance. If they refused, if they continued their harassment and their attempts to exploit me, I would release everything. The fraud, the abuse, the theft, all of it documented and undeniable. Henry had given me the tools. Now I had to decide how to use them. But before I could act my father, the man who stole my life, made a choice so reckless it would force my hand in ways I had never imagined. The Brooks family's desperation metastasized into something uglier than I'd anticipated. I'd expected continued harassment, maybe escalating legal threats, but what came next revealed just how unhinged they'd become when faced with someone who refused to be manipulated. Ashley struck first through social media, her chosen battlefield. She posted a series of tearful videos that were masterclasses in selective truth and emotional manipulation. In one, she held up an eviction notice while crying about how her own sister had abandoned her in her time of greatest need. In another, she played voicemails from creditors while explaining that she'd sacrificed so much for family and now had nowhere to turn. She showed bills and debt notices, carefully angling the camera to hide her designer handbag in the background and the expensive ring she still wore. The videos were edited perfectly, showing her at her most sympathetic, vulnerable, scared, alone. She never mentioned her complete lack of work history, her years of being supported by parents who couldn't afford it, or the fact that she'd spent a decade pursuing influencer dreams instead of building actual skills. She just cried prettily and talked about family abandonment and how wealth had changed me. The posts went viral within our local community. Hundreds of shares, thousands of comments. Strangers who knew nothing about our history weighed in with judgments. This is what's wrong with rich people. Family should come first. Money changes people and not for the better. The narrative she'd crafted was simple and compelling. Poor struggling sister abandoned by wealthy, heartless sibling who'd forgotten where she came from. Local news picked it up as a human interest story, family torn apart by wealth disparity. They interviewed Ashley, who performed beautifully, talking about how we'd been so close growing up and how my success had changed everything. The reporter asked if she'd reached out to me. "So many times," Ashley said, dabbing her eyes. "But she won't even return my calls. I just want my sister back." My business contacts began sending me the links, asking awkwardly if everything was all right. Some believed Ashley's version automatically. Others were more circumspect, but clearly uncomfortable. The professional reputation I'd built carefully over years was being attacked by someone with a smartphone and no regard for truth. My mother, meanwhile, had launched her own campaign through more traditional channels. She was calling my business associates, directly positioning herself as a concerned parent, warning people about her troubled daughter. I learned about it when a longtime business partner called me directly. "Kimberly, I need to tell you something uncomfortable. A woman claiming to be your mother called me yesterday. She said some concerning things about your mental health and how you acquired your initial capital. She suggested that the man who mentored you was senile and that you'd manipulated him. I didn't believe her, but I thought you should know she's making these calls." She was making calls. Plural. My attorney's investigator confirmed she'd contacted at least a dozen people in my business network, each time presenting herself as a worried mother, trying to protect people from her unstable daughter, who'd forged documents and betrayed her family. Most dismissed her, but some didn't. Several business relationships that had been developing suddenly went cold. A speaking engagement was quietly canceled. The Whisper campaign was creating exactly the kind of doubt and friction she intended. Then my father crossed a line that moved beyond harassment into criminal behavior. The police report came through on a Thursday afternoon. Mr. Brooks had been escorted from my beachfront property after attempting to gain entry with a locksmith he'd hired. He'd told the locksmith he was the owner and had been locked out by a tenant. When neighbors noticed and called police, my father had become belligerent, shouting that his daughter had stolen the property and he had family rights to access it. The police report noted that he'd been highly agitated and uncooperative, claiming the officers didn't understand his legal position, threatening to sue the police department for preventing a father from accessing his daughter's property. They'd escorted him off the premises and issued a warning about trespassing. The locksmith, realizing he'd been lied to, refused payment and left immediately. 2 days later, my home security system alerted me to activity at my townhouse at 11 at night. I pulled up the camera feed on my phone and watched Ashley pounding on my front door, then moving to windows, then screaming at my house while my neighbors' lights turned on one by one. The audio was clear enough to catch her words. "I know you're in there, you selfish bitch. You think you're better than us. You think you can just abandon family and face no consequences. Open the fucking door." She pounded on windows hard enough that I worried about broken glass. She kicked at my front door. She stood in my yard screaming for nearly 10 minutes before finally leaving, but not before overturning my mailbox and throwing potted plants at my garage door. Every moment was captured in high definition by 3 different camera angles. I sat in my bedroom watching the footage replay, seeing the rage and entitlement that had finally dropped all pretense of concern or family love. This wasn't about reconnection or support. This was about control and revenge, about people who believed they had rights to my resources and were furious that I dared to refuse them. And that night, as I reviewed security footage of my sister's unhinged rage, I made a decision it was time to end this once and for all. I spent the morning after Ashley's rampage making copies of security footage and organizing documentation into categories: harassment, defamation, trespassing, and fraud. Everything was time-stamped, witnessed, and legally obtained. By noon, I'd made a decision that felt both necessary and measured. I wasn't going to destroy them impulsively. I was going to let the truth do its work. I called Marcus Chen, an investigative journalist I'd met at a business ethics conference 2 years earlier. He worked for the Regional Observer and had built a reputation for fair, meticulous reporting that relied on documentation rather than sensationalism. When we met for coffee that afternoon, I brought a folder containing carefully selected materials. "I'm coming to you because I trust your integrity," I said, sliding the folder across the table. "I'm being harassed by family members who are spreading false information about me and attempting to access my property illegally. But the harassment is just the surface. There's a larger story here about military benefits fraud that I think deserves investigation." Marcus opened the folder and began reading. I'd included photocopies of the VA benefits documentation showing payments made to the Brooks family for my care as a dependent child of a fallen soldier, police reports from the recent trespassing incidents, and court filings showing their frivolous will contest. I'd redacted some identifying details for privacy, but left enough that an investigative journalist could verify the core facts independently. "This is substantial," Marcus said after several minutes of silent reading. "You're alleging they collected benefits meant for you while neglecting your care." "I'm not alleging anything. I'm providing documentation of what occurred. You can verify all of it through VA records, court filings, and public documents. I'm coming forward now because their harassment has escalated to the point where I need to protect myself legally, and I believe the public has an interest in knowing about potential misuse of military survivor benefits." Marcus spent the next week investigating. He contacted the VA, reviewed court records, spoke with Henry's attorney, and even tracked down some of my former teachers who confirmed the neglect they'd witnessed. He was thorough and professional, confirming every fact before writing a word. The article published on a Tuesday morning with the headline, "Local Families' Dark Secret Military Benefits Fraud Alleged." Marcus had written it carefully using alleged, where legally necessary, but presenting documentation that made the implications clear. The article detailed how survivor benefits meant for a veteran's child had been collected by family members who then, according to multiple witnesses and records, provided minimal care for that child. It mentioned the daughter's eventual success and the family's recent attempts to contest inheritance despite no legal standing. It included their harassment campaign and police reports of trespassing. The comment section exploded within hours. Veterans groups were particularly vocal, expressing outrage about potential misuse of benefits meant to honor fallen soldiers. "Stolen valor adjacent" became a common phrase. People who'd believed Ashley's tearful videos now saw them as manipulation from someone who'd lived off stolen military money. The narrative shifted completely and irreversibly. My phone began ringing with calls from business associates who'd been uncertain before now, apologizing for doubting me and expressing support. The speaking engagement that had been canceled was hastily reinstated with an apology about miscommunication. Several people forwarded me messages they'd received from my mother, her defamatory claims now obviously desperate lies in light of documented fraud. The Brooks family's response was predictable and chaotic. My mother called screaming about how I'd destroyed the family name and ruined our lives. My father left voicemails threatening lawsuits for defamation, apparently not understanding that truth is an absolute defense against defamation claims. Ashley's social media presence went dark after being inundated with comments calling her a grifter. And worse. Within 48 hours, I heard through community contacts that they'd become pariahs in their own neighborhood. People crossed the street to avoid them. Former friends stopped returning calls. The church community that had been one of my mother's primary social outlets quietly suggested they might be more comfortable attending services elsewhere. My father's attorney sent a threatening letter about the article. My attorney responded with a single-page letter noting that all information in the article was factually accurate and verified through public records, that truth is an absolute defense to defamation, and that continued frivolous threats would result in a countersuit for harassment and abuse of process. But I knew this wasn't over. Cornered animals were dangerous, and the Brooks family had just been backed into the tightest corner of their lives. They'd lost their reputation, their social standing, and any sympathy they'd managed to generate. They had nothing left to lose, which meant they were about to become even more desperate. But the Brooks family, cornered and humiliated, was about to make their most desperate move, yet one that would finally give me legal grounds to finish this. The article had been published for 3 days when they came to my house at nearly midnight. I was in bed reviewing documents on my tablet when my security system lit up with alerts: motion detected at the front entrance, motion at the side gate, multiple figures approaching the property. I pulled up the camera feeds and felt my stomach drop. All 3 of them were there, moving toward my front door with a purposefulness that looked nothing like a peaceful visit. My father reached the door first and began pounding with both fists, the sound echoing through my quiet neighborhood. "Kimberly, open this door right now. You're going to fix what you broke. Do you hear me? Open this goddamn door." My mother joined in, her voice shrill and hysterical. "You destroyed us. You destroyed your own family. What kind of person does that? What kind of monster are you?" Ashley kicked at the door, then turned her rage on my landscaping, smashing decorative solar lights with her feet and hurling a potted plant at my garage. "You think you can humiliate us like this? You think there aren't consequences?" I stayed perfectly still in my bedroom, phone in hand, watching the security feeds and recording everything. I'd already called 911 before speaking to anyone. Within minutes, I could see lights turning on in neighboring houses, people looking out windows, someone across the street stepping onto their porch with a phone raised recording. My father tried my side gate, found it locked, then picked up a garden stone and threw it at my living room window. The glass shattered inward with a crash that I heard even from upstairs. That's when I heard the sirens approaching. The police arrived to find my father with another stone in his hand, my mother screaming at my house about betrayal and destruction, and Ashley still destroying what remained of my front landscaping. The responding officers separated them immediately, directing each to different areas of my yard while taking statements from neighbors who'd called and recorded the incident. I came downstairs and opened my door only when an officer knocked and identified himself. I provided the security footage showing the entire incident from their arrival through the property destruction to my father breaking my window. The officer's expression grew increasingly grim as he watched. "Ma'am, do you want to press charges?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "All of them. Property damage, attempted breaking and entering, disturbing the peace, threatening behavior, whatever applies." Ashley was arrested on the spot for property destruction and attempted assault. My father was detained for questioning about the broken window and the stone still in his hand. My mother was cited for disturbing the peace and told to leave the property immediately. All three were informed that they were to have no contact with me whatsoever or face additional charges. I watched through my window as neighbors stood in their yards, some still recording, all watching the Brooks family being placed in police vehicles and driven away. The scene was surreal. These people who'd once thrown me out as worthless were now being arrested on my property for trying to intimidate me into submission. At the police station, according to the report I received later, reality had crashed down on them in ways that social disapproval and damaged reputation hadn't managed. They weren't victims confronting an ungrateful daughter. They were adults who'd committed crimes because they believed they had rights to someone else's property and life. Their attorney hastily called in the middle of the night, explained that they were facing potential criminal records, restraining orders, and even civil suits for damages. The consequences were real, immediate, and entirely of their own making. The next morning, my attorney arrived at my house to survey the damage and discuss next steps. Broken window, destroyed landscaping, damaged doorframe from the kicking and pounding. We documented everything with photographs and repair estimates. "We're filing for a permanent restraining order," he said. "Based on the documented harassment, multiple trespassing attempts, property damage, and now this violent incident. We have more than enough evidence." "And the will contest?" I asked. "I'm serving them with an ultimatum today. Drop the will contest immediately and sign agreements to cease all harassment, or we countersue for abuse of process and harassment, and we release all documentation about the military benefits fraud publicly, including evidence about the attack on Henry. I'm also including documentation about your father's employment termination for fraud. Their attorney will advise them to drop everything immediately." The papers were served that afternoon. I imagine the scene when the Brooks family's attorney reviewed what we were threatening to release, not just the VA fraud, but the assault on Henry, the documented child neglect, the employment fraud. Everything that would not only destroy what little reputation they had left, but potentially result in criminal investigations and restitution demands. The attorney called my attorney within 2 hours. "They want to meet," my attorney told me after the call. "They're willing to negotiate anything. They're finally ready to talk terms." I felt no satisfaction, just a weary kind of inevitability. Of course they wanted to negotiate now when they were facing real consequences instead of just damaged pride. Of course they were ready to talk terms when criminal charges and public exposure were imminent. "Set up the meeting," I said. "But it happens at your office with you present, and they come prepared to sign whatever I put in front of them. No negotiation, No discussion, just consequences and terms. "Understood," he said. "I'll schedule it for this week." Because that afternoon I received a call from the attorney. They want to meet. They're willing to negotiate anything. They're finally ready to talk terms. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon at my attorney's conference room, neutral territory, with glass walls and a receptionist who could serve as witness if needed. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a tailored navy suit that projected calm authority. My attorney had prepared a comprehensive presentation of every piece of evidence we had organized chronologically and categorized by offense. We arranged the documents on the conference table like chess pieces in an endgame position. The Brooks family arrived exactly on time, escorted in by the receptionist. The contrast between us was striking. My father wore an ill-fitting suit that looked like it had been purchased from a discount store, the fabric cheap and the shoulders sitting wrong. My mother's face was bare of the heavy makeup she usually wore, making her look older and more haggard than I'd ever seen her. Ashley walked behind them with her arms wrapped around herself, her usual confidence completely absent. They sat on one side of the massive conference table, while my attorney and I sat opposite. The physical arrangement felt symbolic, them on one side defensive, and diminished me on the other with legal representation and documentation. No one spoke for a long moment, the silence heavy with everything that had led us to this room. My attorney began by sliding a bound document across the table. "This is a comprehensive record of every legal violation, every act of harassment, every fraudulent claim, and every documented threat made by the Brooks family against Ms. Brooks over the past several months, with supporting evidence, witness statements, and timestamps." My father reached for it, but his hands trembled slightly as he opened the cover. Inside were police reports, security footage stills, copies of defamatory communications, medical records, VA benefit documentation, and Henry's investigative files. Page after page of undeniable evidence. "We're prepared to take all of this to both criminal and civil court," my attorney continued. "The military benefits fraud alone carries significant penalties, including restitution fines and potential imprisonment. The recent harassment and property destruction are criminal matters currently being processed. The defamation is actionable in civil court. However, Ms. Brooks is willing to offer an alternative resolution." I spoke for the first time, my voice calm and measured. "I'll make this simple because I don't want to spend any more time or energy on this than necessary. I will pay the outstanding balances on your most critical debts, mortgage arrears, the car repossession, the immediate credit card defaults that are threatening you with legal action. I will not give you cash. I will not give you ongoing support. I will pay creditors directly one time only to eliminate your immediate crisis." My mother's eyes lit up with hope, but I held up a hand before she could speak. "In exchange, you will sign legal documents permanently and irrevocably relinquishing any claim to my assets, my inheritance, my estate, or any future earnings or properties. You will agree to no contact terms, no calls, no visits, no emails, no social media, mentions, no communications through third parties, no speaking to press or media about me. You will drop the will contest immediately. You will cease all defamatory statements. If you violate these terms even once, a single phone call, a single social media post, a single conversation with a journalist, I will release all documentation publicly and pursue legal action for every crime and tort possible. This is a one-time offer. Take it or face everything in these documents being filed with courts and released to media." My father's face flushed red. "That's extortion." "That's consequence," I corrected coldly. "You tried to extort me through guilt and social pressure. You harassed me, defamed me, trespassed on my property, and destroyed my belongings. I'm offering you a way to walk away from criminal charges and public humiliation. You're free to decline and take your chances with prosecutors and civil juries." He looked at his attorney, a public defender, who'd been assigned to help with the criminal charges. The man shrugged. "She's right. You have no leverage here. If you don't take this offer, you're looking at criminal prosecution for the VA fraud at minimum, plus the recent property damage and harassment charges. This is a generous offer given the evidence against you." We deserve more than this. My father said, his voice desperate now rather than authoritative. We're family. You can't just... You were never my family, I interrupted, and the words came out with a finality that silenced the room. Henry was my family. He was my real father biologically and in every way that matters. The shock on their faces would have been amusing if the situation weren't so grim. My mother's face went white. Ashley's eyes widened. My father's expression cycled rapidly through disbelief, comprehension, and then rage mixed with fear. I pulled out Henry's letter and the paternity documentation, sliding them across the table. Henry was my biological father. Sarah was my mother. The man sitting across from me attacked Henry and put him in the hospital with a traumatic brain injury, then manipulated the legal system to steal me from my real father. You didn't raise your daughter, you raised the child you stole. And while raising me, you cashed checks meant for my care as a fallen soldier's dependent. You're not my family. You're criminals who exploited me for money while treating me like a burden. My father stared at the documents, his face ashen. My mother made a small sound like a wounded animal. Ashley just looked confused and lost. Sign the papers, I said quietly. Sign them and walk away with your immediate debts cleared and no criminal prosecution. Or refuse and face everything you've done being exposed in public court proceedings. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Finally, my father reached for the pen, his signature angry and heavy on the page. My mother signed with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face. Ashley was the last, her signature small and barely legible. You're free to go, my attorney said, collecting the signed documents. They stood slowly, gathering their belongings with the defeated movements of people who'd just lost everything that mattered to them. As they reached the door, Ashley turned back, her voice barely a whisper. I always knew you were different from us. I just didn't know why until now. My parents moved toward the conference room door with hunched shoulders and defeated steps, but Ashley lingered, standing awkwardly near her chair. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Something raw and uncertain, stripped of the entitlement and performative emotion that usually characterized her interactions. Can I speak to Kimberly alone for a few minutes? She asked quietly. Please, just 5 minutes. My attorney's expression made his opinion clear. This was a bad idea. But I found myself nodding. 5 minutes, I said. You can wait outside, I told my attorney. He left reluctantly, leaving the door slightly ajar. Ashley and I stood on opposite sides of the conference table, the signed documents still scattered between us like the wreckage of a demolished building. I'm not going to ask you for anything. Ashley began, her voice steadier than I expected. I'm not going to make excuses or try to manipulate you into feeling sorry for me. I just need you to know something, and I need to say it before I lose the courage. I stayed silent, waiting. I always felt the favoritism growing up, she said. Even as a kid, I knew something was off about how differently they treated us. I knew it wasn't normal that I got everything while you got nothing. But I didn't understand why until I was about 16. I overheard them fighting one night, Mom and Dad screaming at each other about old betrayals and mistakes. That's when I learned the truth about myself. She paused, taking a shaky breath. I'm not their biological child. Not Mom's, anyway. I'm Dad's daughter from an affair he had early in their marriage. My birth mother died when I was 2, and Dad brought me home. Mom agreed to raise me to keep the marriage together, to maintain appearances, to prove to her family and friends that she could be the bigger person and make it work. I felt my understanding of our childhood shift, slightly pieces, rearranging themselves into a new pattern. The reason they showered me with affection wasn't because I was special or better, Ashley continued. It was because I was evidence of Dad's betrayal and Mom's humiliation. They were trying to bury shame with performative family normalcy. Every time they praised me and ignored you, it wasn't really about us at all. It was about them trying to prove they could be good parents, trying to make up for whatever they'd done to you. Though I didn't know the full extent of that until today. She looked down at the documents on the table. I was the prop in their redemption story, and you were the reminder of their failures. I got love that was conditional on maintaining an illusion. You got nothing. And somehow you became stronger because of it while I became this. She gestured at herself with something like disgust. When I was little, I was jealous of how you and Henry looked at each other. Ashley said, her voice breaking slightly. You had something real. He chose you and loved you without conditions or performance. I had to be perfect every single day to maintain their approval, and even then I could feel it was hollow. When I started failing, when I couldn't maintain the illusion anymore, they didn't know what to do with me. I was supposed to be the success story that validated their parenting. When I became just another failure, I had no value to them. She wiped her eyes roughly with the back of her hand. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I participated in the cruelty. I was complicit in the exploitation. I benefited from favoritism I knew was wrong. I took your money and your labor and your sacrifice, and I acted like it was owed to me. I recorded you being thrown out of the house, and I thought it was funny. I don't deserve forgiveness for any of that. Then why are you telling me this? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Because you should know that the family you thought rejected you was never really a family at all. It was a performance built on lies and shame and fraud. None of it was about you being inadequate. It was always about them being broken. She picked up her bag slowly. And because I want to say thank you. Thank you. For ending this, Ashley said simply. For being strong enough to walk away, to build something real, to finally force all of us to face consequences instead of living in that toxic bubble of delusion. We all needed you to be stronger than us, and you were. I'm sorry it cost you so much. She moved toward the door, then paused. I don't expect to see you again. I don't expect you to think of me as a sister or to include me in your life in any way. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. Henry was your real father, and he loved you the way a parent should. The rest of us were just people who happened to live in the same house hurting each other because we were all trapped in a lie we didn't know how to escape. She opened the door, then looked back one last time. I hope you build something beautiful with your life, Kimberly. You deserve that. You always did. Then she walked out, and I stood alone in the conference room, surrounded by signed documents that severed legal ties to people who'd never really been my family at all. I sat down slowly, processing Ashley's confession. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as another manipulation, but the raw honesty in her voice had felt genuine, in a way nothing she'd ever said to me before had felt. She'd been another victim of the Brooks family's dysfunction, just a different kind of victim. That didn't excuse her cruelty, didn't erase the years of complicity, but it complicated the simple narrative of villain and victim I'd been carrying. And as I watched my sister walk away, I felt something unexpected, not forgiveness, but release, like a weight I didn't know I carried finally lifting. The weeks following the signed agreements felt surreal in their quietness. After months of harassment threats and escalating conflict, the sudden absence of the Brooks family from my life created a space I wasn't quite sure how to fill. But I'd made promises in that conference room, and I intended to keep them not out of love or obligation, but because I'd given my word, and because justice demanded I follow through. My attorney oversaw the execution of every term. The mortgage arrears were paid through Summit Financial Recovery, the collection agency I controlled, but with conditions. The payment prevented immediate foreclosure, but the Brooks family was placed on a strict repayment plan for the remaining mortgage balance. They would keep their house, but they would be accountable for it in ways they'd never been before. No more living beyond their means, no more assuming someone would bail them out. They would make payments on time or face consequences. The car situation was handled similarly. I paid enough to stop the repossession proceedings, but the loan balance remained their responsibility. They would make monthly payments or lose the vehicle. The critical credit card defaults, the ones that were threatening lawsuits and wage garnishment, I cleared completely through direct payments to creditors. But the remaining credit card debt, the personal loans, the accumulated consequences of years of financial irresponsibility, those remained theirs to manage. It wasn't generosity. it was strategy. I'd given them just enough to stay off the streets and avoid immediate catastrophe, but not enough to be comfortable or to return to their old patterns. They would learn to live within their means because they finally had no choice. And if they violated the no-contact agreement, even once, I would stop all support immediately and release everything. The beachfront property required a different kind of decision. It was worth millions, appreciating steadily as the area developed. I could have kept it as an investment, sold it for substantial profit, or even used it myself. But every time I thought about that property, I thought about Henry, how he'd purchased it strategically, how he'd left it to me with detailed notes about its potential, how it represented his careful planning for my future security. I wanted it to mean more than personal wealth. I contacted a nonprofit organization I'd been researching, one that provided transitional housing and support services for youth aging out of foster care. These were young people who at 18 were legally adults, but had no family support, no safety net, nowhere to go. They were like I'd been at 17, except they didn't even have the option of going home to people who treated them badly. They just had nothing. The donation was structured carefully through my attorney. The property would be transferred to the nonprofit with the condition that it be named the Henry Brooks Hope House, and that it serve specifically as transitional housing with wraparound services, job training, educational support, mentorship. The nonprofit would handle operations, but I would maintain involvement through a board position to ensure Henry's vision was honored. Local press picked up the story, running a feature about the donation and the purpose behind it. The article included background about Henry's military service, his commitment to helping vulnerable young people, and how his legacy was being transformed into ongoing support for youth who needed exactly what he'd given me: a chance, a foundation, a reason to believe they could build something meaningful from nothing. The positive coverage felt almost redemptive after months of Ashley's tearful videos and my mother's whisper campaigns. But more than reputation management, the donation felt right. It transformed something Henry had built for me into something that would help hundreds of young people over the years. His love multiplied and extended far beyond us. With the Brooks family finally out of my life and the beachfront property committed to meaningful purpose, I turned my attention to restructuring my own business holdings. For years, I'd operated through shell companies and trusts, keeping my name off public documents, maintaining strategic invisibility. But I was done hiding, not because I wanted fame or recognition, but because I'd built something legitimate and substantial that deserved to exist in daylight rather than shadow. I worked with my attorney and financial advisors to consolidate my various interests under a single holding company, Brooks Enterprises, KTB Logistics. My real estate holdings, my investment stakes in various companies, all of it organized under one corporate umbrella with proper governance, professional management, and transparent operations. I hired a CEO for KTB Logistics, someone with logistics expertise who could handle day-to-day operations, while I focused on strategic direction and growth planning. I brought in a professional property management firm to oversee my real estate portfolio. I was transitioning from someone who did everything myself out of necessity to someone who built teams and systems that could operate without me being involved in every detail. I was moving from operator to steward, from building wealth to building impact. The girl who'd once had nothing was now thinking about generational legacy, about what would outlast her, about how to use resources to create opportunity for others, the way Henry had created opportunity for me. My days became filled with strategic planning rather than operational firefighting, with philanthropic discussions rather than survival calculations. I was building something that would matter beyond my own life. I was beginning to feel something I hadn't felt in months: peace. Not happiness exactly, but a quiet sense that I was finally living the life Henry had wanted for me, the life he'd spent years positioning me to build. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon, my receptionist buzzed my office. "Ms. Brooks, there's a gentleman here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's about Henry. He says it's urgent and personal." I almost declined, assuming it was another complication I didn't need. But something made me agree to 5 minutes. The man who entered my office was perhaps mid-40s, with Henry's eyes and Henry's careful way of moving. He carried a leather briefcase and wore an expression that mixed nervousness with determination. Before I could ask who he was or what he wanted, he spoke. "Ms. Brooks, my name is Daniel. I'm Henry's son and your brother." But just as I began to feel peace, a stranger appeared at my office with a briefcase and a sentence that stopped my heart. "Ms. Brooks, my name is Daniel. I'm Henry's son and your brother." I stared at the man standing in my office doorway, my mind struggling to process what he'd just said. Henry's son. My brother. The words felt impossible, even though I was looking at someone who had Henry's eyes, Henry's careful posture, even Henry's way of holding himself with quiet dignity. "I know this is a shock," Daniel said quickly, reading my expression. "I should have called ahead, but I was afraid you'd refuse to see me. May I sit down? I have documentation, and I promise this will make sense." I gestured numbly to the chair across from my desk, and he sat opening his briefcase with deliberate care. He pulled out a folder and slid it across to me. A birth certificate showing Henry Brooks as father and Sarah Chen as mother, dated 2 years before my own birth. The child's name was listed as Daniel Chen Brooks, born at the same hospital where I'd later be born. Sarah had twins. Daniel began, his voice steady but emotional. "Me and you." But her family, our maternal grandparents, they were horrified. An unmarried daughter pregnant by a soldier they considered beneath their social standing was bad enough. Twins made it worse, made it impossible to hide. So they made a decision. He pulled out more papers, adoption records, letters, family documents. They gave me to Sarah's younger sister, my Aunt Emily, who lived in Oregon and had been told she couldn't have children. The family story was that Emily had adopted a child from a private adoption. I grew up knowing Emily as my mother, never knowing about Sarah, about Henry, about you. It wasn't until I turned 18 and Emily was dying of cancer that she told me the truth. She gave me these documents and said I deserved to know where I came from. "You knew about me," I said, finding my voice. "All this time you knew I existed." "I found Henry when I was 19, Daniel said. "I used the documents Emily gave me to track him down. He was shocked, overwhelmed, and then once he verified everything, he was overjoyed. He told me about you, about how he'd been watching over you from a distance, about the Brooks family situation. He asked me to wait to contact you." "Wait for what?" Daniel pulled out a letter in Henry's handwriting dated 5 years ago. He said this: "Your sister has had to fight for everything her entire life. She's still fighting battles that would break most people. When you meet her, she needs to have won those battles. She needs to be strong enough that learning about you is a gift, not another burden. Don't burden her with this when she's still fighting. Wait until she's won." Tears blurred my vision as I read Henry's words. Even in this, even in keeping a secret about a brother I never knew I had, he'd been protecting me, thinking strategically about what I needed and when I needed it. "I've been waiting," Daniel continued softly, "watching from a distance like Henry taught me to do. When the news articles came out about your success, about the Brooks family's harassment, about the confrontation, I knew the battles were coming to an end. When I saw the article about the Hope House donation, I knew you'd won. That's when Henry wanted me to come to you. When you were strong enough, successful enough, healed enough, that I would be family, not another complication." He pulled out a photo album from his briefcase, opening it to reveal pictures I'd never seen. Sarah, our mother, pregnant and smiling. Henry, younger, in military uniform with his arm around her. Photos of Sarah holding 2 babies, Daniel and me, in a hospital room, her face radiant despite the obvious exhaustion. The family I should have had, captured in images that had been hidden for decades. "Henry told me stories about you," Daniel said. "How you learned his business so quickly, how you asked questions that showed you were really thinking, not just following instructions. He told me about your first property deal, your first employee hire, your first successful negotiation. He was so proud of you, Kimberly. Every achievement, every milestone, he told me about all of it, because he couldn't tell you how proud he was without revealing too much. I couldn't speak through the tears, so Daniel continued. I don't want anything from you. I need to make that clear right away. I'm a civil engineer. I'm married, I have 2 kids, I live a quiet life in Washington State. I'm financially comfortable. Henry left me some money, too enough to be secure. I'm not here for inheritance or business opportunities or anything except this. I want to offer you family, real family, the kind that doesn't come with conditions or expectations. He pulled out his phone and showed me photos. A woman with kind eyes and an easy smile, his wife Karen. 2 children, a boy about 10 and a girl about 7, grinning at the camera. These are your niece and nephew. They know about you and they've been asking to meet their Aunt Kimberly. Karen wants to welcome you. We want you to know that you have people who chose you before we even met you, because Henry told us who you were and we loved you for surviving everything he described. I don't know what to say, I managed. You don't have to say anything yet, Daniel said gently. I'm staying in town for a few days. Here's my number. Call me if and when you're ready. No pressure, no expectations. I just wanted you to know you're not alone anymore. You have a brother who understands what it means to be Henry's child. You have family who wants you, who chose you, who's been waiting for the right time to tell you that you matter to us. He stood collecting his documents but leaving the photo album. That's for you. Pictures of our mother, of Henry when he was young, of the family we should have had. Whatever happens next is up to you, Kimberly. But I hope you'll let us be part of your life. And for the first time since Henry died, I felt something I thought was lost forever, the possibility of belonging to someone who actually wanted me. I called Daniel the next morning, my hand shaking as I dialed the number he'd left. We met for coffee, and this time the conversation lasted 4 hours. He told me about growing up in Oregon, always feeling like something was missing, discovering the truth, and then discovering Henry. I told him about the shelter, about building a business from nothing, about finally learning Henry was my father. We compared notes on the man who'd shaped both our lives, finding connections and similarities that made us laugh and cry in equal measure. 2 weeks later, I flew to Washington to meet his family. Karen welcomed me with a hug that felt genuine and undemanding. The children were shy at first, but warmed quickly when they realized I wasn't some intimidating stranger, but just another person who loved their grandfather. We spent a weekend together, and I watched the way Daniel's family operated with affection and boundaries, with correction and encouragement, with love that didn't demand performance in exchange. It was in those moments, watching Daniel help his son with homework without criticism, watching Karen comfort their daughter after a playground conflict, without shaming, that I began to understand what I'd missed. This was what family could look like. This was what Henry had wanted for me. When I returned home, I called Daniel with a proposal. I want to establish a foundation in Henry's name. Something that does for other people what Henry did for me, gives them tools and opportunity and belief that they can build something meaningful. And I want you to be co-director. We spent months planning the Henry Brooks Foundation, structuring it to serve young adults aging out of foster care or leaving broken family situations. The programs were comprehensive full scholarships for education or vocational training, business mentorship, pairing recipients with successful entrepreneurs, financial literacy courses teaching the practical skills schools often didn't cover. We wanted to give people not just money, but knowledge, not just opportunity, but support. The foundation's mission statement took weeks to perfect, but when we finalized it, it felt exactly right. For those who were told they weren't enough, we say you are everything. For those who had to raise themselves, we offer guidance. For those building futures from nothing, we provide tools. It was personal and powerful, addressing directly the young person I'd been at 17, the one Henry had seen potential in when everyone else saw only a burden. Daniel encouraged me to speak publicly about the foundation and my journey. I'd always avoided the spotlight, but he argued that my story could inspire others and attract support for the foundation's work. Reluctantly, I began accepting speaking invitations, first at small business conferences, then at community events, eventually at larger forums where my message reached hundreds. I learned to tell my story not for sympathy, but as illustration of resilience and strategic thinking. I talked about Henry's mentorship about building businesses through consistency rather than shortcuts, about the importance of ethical wealth building. I spoke carefully about family structures that harm rather than heal, about finding chosen family that reflects your values, never naming the Brooks family, but addressing the reality that not all families are safe or supportive. My authenticity resonated. After speaking engagements, people approached with their own stories of broken families and hard-won success. Business leaders asked about consulting opportunities. Young entrepreneurs sought advice. I was becoming not just wealthy but influential, using my platform to advocate for the kind of support I desperately needed at 17. But the most profound healing came through simply spending time with Daniel's family. I flew to Washington once a month, and they visited me quarterly. I watched Daniel parent his children with patience I'd never experienced as a child. I watched Karen create a home where mistakes were learning opportunities rather than occasions for shame. I watched my niece struggle with math homework and receive encouragement to keep trying rather than criticism for not understanding immediately. One evening, Daniel's son knocked over a glass of juice at dinner, and I braced instinctively for the explosion of anger I'd learned to expect from such incidents. Instead, Daniel simply handed him paper towels and said, "Accidents happen. Let's clean it up together." The child wasn't shamed, wasn't yelled at, wasn't made to feel worthless over spilled juice. It was such a small moment, but it cracked something open inside me. Later that night, Karen found me crying in their guest room. "I didn't know," I told her. "I didn't know family could be like this. I thought what I experienced was normal, just how things were. Watching you all together, I'm realizing how much I lost, how damaged the Brooks family was, how different everything could have been." Karen sat beside me and took my hand. "You didn't lose anything, Kimberly. You never had it to begin with, which is worse. But you have it now. You have us. You have Daniel. You have those kids out there who think their Aunt Kimberly is the coolest person in the world. Family isn't about blood or shared history. It's about choosing to show up for each other consistently and without conditions. We choose you." I started laughing more. I relaxed in their presence in ways I never had with anyone except Henry. I learned that love didn't have to be earned through perfect performance, that belonging was possible simply because I existed and they wanted me there. The groundbreaking ceremony for the Henry Brooks Hope House brought everything together. Daniel and his family flew in for the event. Foundation board members attended. Local officials spoke about the importance of supporting vulnerable youth. The first cohort of young people who would live in the Hope House stood beside me as we turned the first shovel of earth. Standing there with a shovel in my hands, surrounded by Daniel and Karen and the children, by people who believed in Henry's vision, by young adults who would benefit from his legacy, I finally understood what this journey had been about. And as I stood at the groundbreaking ceremony for the Henry Brooks Hope House, surrounded by the family I chose and was chosen by, I realized my story wasn't about revenge, it was about reclamation. The foundation had been operating for just over a year when the letter arrived. I recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately, my mother's careful, precise script that I'd seen on grocery lists and angry notes throughout my childhood. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened, but curiosity won out. I sat at my kitchen table with coffee growing cold and read words I never expected to see. There was no greeting, no "Dear Kimberly," just her words starting mid-thought as if we'd been in conversation all along. She wrote that she'd been in therapy for 6 months working through what her therapist called complicated grief and unresolved family trauma. She didn't apologize directly, but she acknowledged things I'd waited my entire life to hear, acknowledged. "I resented you from the moment you were born," she wrote. "You looked exactly like Sarah, my sister, the woman everyone loved, while I was always the difficult one, the jealous one, the one who wasn't quite enough." Sarah had Henry's love. She had his 2 children, though I didn't know about Daniel then. She had everything I wanted, and then she died, and I was left raising her daughter as my own. Every time I looked at you, I saw her. I saw the sister I envied and lost. I saw the life I didn't get to have. And I took that out on you, a child who had no responsibility for any of it. You deserved better than I gave you. That's my failure, not yours." She wrote about the therapy sessions where she'd had to confront her own choices, her complicity in the benefits fraud, her willingness to look the other way while her husband abused a child. "I told myself I was protecting my marriage, keeping my family together. But I was protecting my pride and my comfort at the expense of a child's well-being. I understand now what I did. I understand that understanding doesn't undo it." The letter ended simply, "I hope you're well. I'm trying to be better now, but I understand it's too late for us. You built a good life without us. That's probably the only thing I can feel good about, that you survived us and thrived anyway." There was no return address, no phone number, no invitation to respond. Just acknowledgement floating in the space between us like a white flag raised after the war was already over. I put the letter in a drawer and didn't think about it for months. Life moved forward: foundation work, business, expansion, monthly visits with Daniel's family. The letter became background noise, something that had happened but didn't require action or response. Then, on a Saturday morning in autumn, I stopped at a coffee shop in a town 30 minutes from mine, somewhere I'd never been before. I was standing in line when I saw her, my mother, sitting alone at a corner table with a paperback book and a nearly empty cup. She looked older than I remembered, her hair more gray than brown, her face bare of the heavy makeup she'd always worn. She was dressed simply in jeans and a plain sweater, no designer labels, no pretense. Our eyes met. I saw recognition flicker across her face, then something like resignation. She didn't stand, didn't wave, just gave a small nod of acknowledgement, and looked back down at her book as if giving me the choice of whether to engage. I surprised myself by walking over to her table. "May I sit for a moment?" I asked. She looked up and I saw genuine surprise in her expression. "Of course." We sat in awkward silence for a few seconds before I spoke. "I got your letter. I didn't expect you to respond. I didn't write it expecting anything from you." "I know," I said. "That's probably why I'm sitting here now." She closed her book carefully, marking her place. "I've been following your foundation's work. The articles about the Hope House opening the scholarship programs. It's impressive. Henry would be proud." Something in her voice when she said his name made me look at her more carefully. "Did you know about Henry being my father?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I suspected. The way he looked at you at that shelter, the way he took you in so readily. And you had Sarah's eyes and Henry's determination, but I never asked, never confirmed it. It was easier not to know officially. Because if you knew, you'd have to confront what was done to them, to us." "Yes," she said simply, "and I wasn't ready to confront much of anything back then. I'm trying to be ready now, but I know it's far too late." We talked for perhaps 15 minutes. The conversation stilted but more honest than any we'd ever had. She asked about the foundation's work, and I shared about our first group of scholarship recipients, about the mentorship programs, about Daniel's involvement. She listened without the performative interest she'd always shown before, seeming genuinely curious about what I'd built. As our conversation wound down, she said something that caught me completely off guard. "Sarah would be proud of you. I spent so many years resenting her memory, resenting you for reminding me of her, that I never let myself see what Henry saw, that you had her strength and compassion. I wish I'd let myself see her in you instead of resenting it. Maybe things would have been different." It was perhaps the most honest thing she'd ever said to me, and the most vulnerable. I felt something shift in my chest, not forgiveness exactly, but a releasing of something I'd been holding tightly without realizing it. "I hope your therapy helps," I said, standing. "I hope you find peace with your choices." She nodded. "Take care of yourself, Kimberly." "You too." I left the coffee shop and drove home, my mind processing the encounter. That evening, Daniel and Karen came for dinner, and I told them about seeing my mother. Karen asked how I felt about it. "I don't know," I admitted. It wasn't reconciliation. We're not going to have a relationship, but it felt like closing something that had been left open. Daniel leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. Henry once told me something about forgiveness. He said it isn't about them deserving it. It's about you deserving peace. He said carrying anger and hurt was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I don't forgive her, I said carefully. Not in the way that means I excuse what she did or want her back in my life. But I think I'm letting go of the anger. She'll always be the person who hurt me, who failed me, who chose comfort over compassion. But she doesn't define me anymore. I've built something so much bigger and more meaningful than her rejection. Karen reached across the table and squeezed my hand. That's not forgiveness. That's freedom. And as I prepared for the Foundation's first scholarship awards ceremony, I understood that the greatest revenge was never revenge at all. It was becoming so genuinely happy that their opinions stopped mattering. The scholarship awards ceremony took place on a Saturday afternoon in the community center adjacent to the Hope House. We'd chosen the location deliberately. We wanted the recipients to see the physical space that represented possibility, to understand that the foundation wasn't just about money, but about creating tangible places where young people could build futures. 10 recipients sat in the front row, ages 18 to 22, each selected from hundreds of applications. Their stories, which I'd read during the selection process, haunted me with their familiarity. Foster care systems that failed them, families that abandoned them, adults who were supposed to protect them but didn't. And through it all, a determination to survive, to build something better, to prove that their circumstances didn't define their potential. Daniel opened the ceremony with remarks about Henry the veteran, who'd understood what it meant to fight battles both on foreign soil and in everyday life, who'd believed that the greatest service was helping others find their strength. Karen spoke about the Foundation's programs and the community of support we were building. Then it was my turn. I looked at those 10 young faces and saw myself at 17 standing in a shelter with nothing but determination and a business textbook. I saw the fear they were trying to hide, the hope they were afraid to fully embrace the wounds they carried that hadn't yet healed. You've already won the hardest battle, I told them, my voice steady and clear. You survived what should have broken you. You're sitting here today not because someone rescued you, but because you refused to give up on yourselves even when everyone else did. Everything that happens from here, every class you take, every business you build, every goal you achieve is proof that they were wrong about you. The people who said you wouldn't amount to anything, who treated you like you were disposable, who made you feel like you had to earn the right to exist, they were wrong. You were never the problem. You were always enough. Several of the recipients were crying. So was I. So were most of the people in the audience, Daniel and his family business associates, who'd become genuine friends, board members who'd committed their time and resources to this work, and graduates from the Hope House programs who'd come to celebrate the next generation. After the ceremony, young people approached to share their stories and their gratitude. I hugged them, listened to them, told them about the mentorship programs and the ongoing support they'd receive. This wasn't a one-time scholarship. This was a community, a family of people who understood what it meant to build something from nothing. As the crowd dispersed, I slipped away and drove to the coast. The Hope House sat on a bluff overlooking the ocean, the building Henry had envisioned now fully realized and filled with life. Young adults moved through the common areas, some studying, some cooking dinner together, some just sitting and talking in the way people do when they finally feel safe enough to relax. I walked down to the beach, taking off my shoes and feeling sand beneath my feet. This was where Henry's property had been the strategic investment he'd made decades ago, knowing it would appreciate leaving it to me with careful instructions about its potential. He'd never seen this transformation. The property donated, the Hope House built, the lives being changed. But I felt his presence in every grain of sand and every wave that rolled to shore. I thought about the 17-year-old girl who'd climbed out of a bedroom window with one bag and no plan beyond survival. I thought about the woman who'd spent 20 years building businesses and wealth while operating in shadows, afraid that visibility meant vulnerability. I thought about discovering Henry was my father, about meeting Daniel, about confronting the Brooks family, and choosing justice over revenge. I thought about Henry watching my childhood from auditorium back rows and sheltered doorways, a father who couldn't claim his daughter but never stopped protecting her. He'd left me tools to build a life, not just wealth to spend. He'd taught me that self-respect was the real currency, that power used ethically was the only power worth having, that family was about choice and consistency rather than blood and obligation. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel, a photo of his kids holding handmade signs that read, "Best Aunt Ever," with misspellings and glitter, and the kind of enthusiastic chaos only children can create. Their faces were scrunched in ridiculous expressions designed to make me laugh. And I did laugh genuinely and freely, the sound carrying across the empty beach. When was the last time I'd laughed like that? When had joy become something I could access without fear or reservation? I pulled up my phone contacts and scrolled through names. Business partners I trusted. Foundation board members committed to our mission. Daniel and Karen and the kids. Young adults I mentored who texted me with questions and updates and occasional memes. Friends I'd made through speaking engagements and community work. My life was full of people who'd chosen to be there, who showed up consistently, who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. I owned properties across 3 states. I ran businesses that employed hundreds. I directed a foundation that was changing lives. I made decisions that affected people's futures positively. These were accomplishments worth acknowledging, tangible evidence of the journey I'd traveled. But more than any of that, I liked who I was. I liked the woman who'd survived abandonment and built something meaningful. I liked that I'd chosen justice over cruelty, that I'd established boundaries without becoming bitter, that I'd built a family of choice rather than settling for the family of circumstance. The validation I'd once desperately sought from people incapable of giving it, the approval of parents who saw me as a burden, the love of a family that was never really mine, none of that mattered anymore. I was free. Not because I'd destroyed the Brooks family, though they'd certainly faced consequences for their actions. Not because I'd taken revenge, though I'd held them accountable. I was free because I'd built a life so full of genuine connection and meaningful purpose that their rejection had lost its power to wound me. They'd become irrelevant, not through my hatred, but through my healing. I was no longer the forgotten daughter or the rejected child. I was Kimberly Brooks Henry's daughter in blood and spirit, Daniel's sister, an aunt to 2 beautiful children, a mentor to young people building futures from nothing, a business owner, a philanthropist, a woman who'd transformed pain into purpose. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The Hope House lights glowed warm against the darkening sky. Somewhere inside, young people were making dinner, doing homework, dreaming about futures they were finally free to build. I stood on the beach where my father had once owned property, where he'd planted seeds for my security decades before I knew he was my father, and I felt something I'd never truly felt before. Not happiness exactly, though I was happy. Not success, though I was successful. It was simpler and more profound than either of those things. For the first time in my life, the world didn't feel like a battle. It felt like home, and that was the victory no one could ever take from me. And so, standing on that beach as the sun set over the Pacific, I understood that my story had never really been about revenge or vindication. It had been about reclaiming myself, the self that had been buried under years of rejection, neglect, and manipulation. The self that Henry had always seen even when I couldn't see it myself. The Brooks family faded into the background of my life, becoming footnotes rather than defining chapters. I heard that my father eventually found work at a lower level, that my mother downsized and learned to live within her means, that Ashley took a retail job and seemed to be building self-sufficiency. I felt neither satisfaction nor concern. They were simply people who'd once been part of my story, now living their own separate narratives. The anger I'd carried had dissolved through building a life so full that their absence no longer left a void. What mattered was what I'd built from the wreckage, Within 3 years, the foundation awarded over 50 scholarships, placed 24 young entrepreneurs in mentorship programs, and graduated 60 young adults from the Hope House. Each success story felt personal. Each life changed validated Henry's belief that people deserved opportunities, not judgment. The ripple effects extended beyond tracking scholarship recipients who became mentors themselves. Hope House graduates who returned to volunteer, young entrepreneurs who hired other foster youth. Daniel became not just a brother, but a true partner in this work. His engineering mind brought structure to the foundation's operations, while his empathy made him invaluable in connecting with the young people we served. Our monthly meetings became family gatherings filled with his children's laughter and Karen's warmth. His kids called me Aunt Kim and showed me their school projects with the unself-conscious pride of children who'd never doubted they were loved. I thought often about my choices during those months of confrontation. I could have destroyed the Brooks family completely. I had the evidence, the resources, and the justification to pursue criminal charges. I could have released everything publicly or withheld all financial assistance and watched them lose everything. But Henry's voice always echoed, "Power used ethically is the only power worth having." I'd chosen accountability over annihilation consequences, over cruelty boundaries, over bitterness. In making those choices, I'd proven I was fundamentally different from the people who'd raised me. I hadn't become them. I'd become more fully myself, someone who could be powerful without being vindictive, who could establish boundaries without seeking destruction. The business continued to thrive. KTB Logistics expanded into 3 new markets. My real estate holdings appreciated steadily, and the investment portfolio provided passive income that funded both my life and the foundation's work. But the businesses were no longer the center of my identity. They were tools that enabled the work that mattered: the mentorship, the scholarships, the creation of opportunities for people who reminded me of the girl I'd been. I even started dating again, a teacher who volunteered with youth programs, who understood that my past shaped me but didn't define me. It was early, tentative, but healthy in ways my previous relationships never had been. I was learning that I could be loved without earning it, that vulnerability didn't have to mean danger. On the 2nd anniversary of Henry's death, I stood at his grave with Daniel and his family. We'd added "beloved father" to his headstone, truth finally acknowledged publicly. I told him about the foundation's growth, about the lives being changed in his name. "You gave me everything," I said aloud. "Not just money or property. You gave me the belief that I was worth something. You gave me tools to build a life that matters. You gave me a brother I didn't know I needed. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure other people get the same gifts you gave me." The wind moved through the trees, and I chose to believe Henry heard me. The following Monday, I received an email from one of our first scholarship recipients. She'd just graduated with a social work degree and been hired by a nonprofit serving foster youth. "I want to be for other kids what the foundation was for me," she wrote. "I want to show them that their past doesn't determine their future. Thank you for seeing potential in me when I couldn't see it in myself." I read that email 3 times, understanding that this was the true measure of success, not the businesses or properties or net worth. The true measure was in the ripples in young people who'd received help, now helping others in cycles of trauma being broken, in proof that pain could be transformed into purpose. The girl who'd been thrown out into the rain would hardly recognize the woman I'd become. But Henry would recognize me. He'd seen this person all along beneath the fear and wounds. He'd seen potential where others saw problem, strength where others saw weakness, a future where others saw only a troubled past. And now finally I could see what he'd always seen. I could look in the mirror and recognize not the daughter the Brooks family had rejected, but the daughter Henry had claimed. Not the burden, but the builder. Not the mistake, but the woman who'd turned rejection into resilience, pain into purpose, and a childhood of being told she wasn't enough into a life of showing others that they were everything. The world didn't feel like a battle anymore. It felt like home, and that sense of belonging to myself, to my chosen family, to the work that gave my life meaning was the victory no one could ever take from me. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. I'd love to know. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to find your own path? Have you experienced transformation from choosing yourself when everyone else chose someone else? Drop a comment below and share your story. I read every single one. What part of this story resonated with you most? Was it standing up to my family, the revelation about Henry, the decision to channel pain into purpose, or maybe something else? A line that hit home, a scene that reminded you of your own life? Let me know in the comments. Your perspective helps me understand what stories matter most. If this story moved you, if it gave you hope that transformation is possible, even after the hardest betrayals, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I share stories about resilience, about overcoming impossible odds, about people who refuse to let their worst moments define their lives. Every week, there's a new story about someone who chose to rise, rather than remain broken. If you know someone who needs to hear this, someone walking away from family toxicity, someone building a life from nothing, someone who feels like the forgotten child, share this video. Sometimes we need to see someone else's journey to believe our own transformation is possible. What happens next in your story? That's the real question. My story isn't special because I succeeded. It's meaningful because I chose to keep going when giving up would have been easier. You have that same choice every day. What are you going to build with it? Leave your thoughts below. Subscribe for more stories of transformation. And remember, you were never the problem. You were always enough. Sometimes it just takes walking away from people who can't see your worth to finally build a life that reflects your true value. I'll see you in the next story.